Okay, welcome back to the table this morning, everyone. Today is day 2 of our February Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council meeting. We're meeting here in Arlington, Virginia. My name is Mike Luisi, and I am a member of the council from the state of Maryland. I currently serve as the vice chair of the council. Wes Townsend, who is the council's chair, was unable to make it here to be with us today, so I'll be facilitating the meeting and chairing the meeting throughout the day today. We are going to start off our agenda with offshore wind updates. And I'd like to turn things over here in just a second to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, but Julia Beatty, who serves as our council lead staff person on offshore wind, is with us online. And Julia, I just wanted to ask you if there's anything that you'd like to say before we get started here today.
Sure. So I think most of these presenters are here in person and online. We have a good group of people here today, and it's up to you, Mr. Chair, how you want to run the meeting, but I did, the presenters are all planning for a few individual presentations, and then we have some time at the end for a question and answer and discussion session across all presenters. So just to give you a heads up of what they're all prepared for. And you can see on the screen here the list of folks who are presenting. We'll have general updates from BOEM, and then an update on the state working group on a third-party fisheries compensation fund administrator, and then 3 from Vineyard Wind, focusing on their compensation fund for the construction that's happening right now. And then we have general updates from Kitty Hawk Wind and Community Offshore Wind.
Okay, thanks, Julia. I think I'll just kind of play it by ear as we go through and see what the timing looks like for this item, this agenda item. And we maybe take some questions during and after the presentations, and then we'll have time, try to reserve some time for more kind of a panel discussion. I will say, I was just sitting here joking with Chris. I know that I've met probably everybody in the room, but as each year passes, sometimes it's harder to remember all the names and affiliations of everyone around in the room here today. So I apologize if somebody's name, if I miss somebody's name throughout the day. So let's start off. I do know Kirby. Kirby and I are old friends from the ASMFC days. Welcome, Kirby. And he's joined by his colleague, Seth. They're going to start with a activity update on the Mid-Atlantic issues on wind. So Kirby, whenever you're ready, I'll kick it off to you.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chair. It's great to see so many familiar faces around the table. For those that don't know me, my name is Kirby Roots-Murdy, and I am a renewable energy program specialist with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management in their Office of Renewable Energy Programs. I'm here today with my colleague, Seth Tierkoff, and we will be providing a few updates on topics requested by the Mid-Atlantic Council staff. So moving on to our next slide. On the screen are a list of topics that Seth and I will be tag teaming for the presentation. Seth will provide updates on the proposed sale notice for the Central Atlantic Wind Energy Areas, or WEAs that we refer to them as well as the New York Bight Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement process. I'll follow up with project-specific updates on the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Commercial Lease, CVAL, as well as Empire Wind, the Fisheries Mitigation Guidance Document, and conclude with a brief overview of fisheries research studies that BOEM has funded. We will make time at the end of our presentation to take any questions, and we'll be available after this morning's session to answer any additional questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Seth.
Great. Thank you, Kirby, and thank you to the council for hosting us here today. As Kirby shared, my name is Seth Tierkoff. I'm a project coordinator with BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs, and I'm going to be providing an update on the Central Atlantic planning and leasing effort. So most recently, apologies for that. Here's our slide for this content here. So most recently, BOEM published the proposed sale notice for the Central Atlantic proposed lease areas that was published on December 11th of last year. Within that notice, there are two proposed lease areas. They're indicated on the map on the screen here. OCSA 0557, that corresponds with the area A on the map on the slide here. That's approximately totaling around 101,000 acres, and it's around 26 nautical miles from Delaware Bay. The other lease area that's described in the proposed sale notice is OCSA 0558. That's approximately 176,500 acres, and that is located around 35 nautical miles from Chesapeake Bay. That lease area is adjacent to the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind or CVOW project that Kirby is going to be providing an update on here in just a few slides. So associated with the proposed sale notice is a comment period. That comment period is open now through February 12th, so closing relatively soon. And we welcome comments from the council on a range of topics, but particularly on conflicts that we may not have previously considered, as well as comments that would help us to further shape the lease areas as we go from the proposed sale notice to actual lease areas that are to be auctioned later this year. The process that we use to identify lease areas, proposed lease areas, involved a partnership with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science to utilize spatial modeling to identify the least conflicted areas within the region. BOEM is aware of specifically surf clam and sea scallop fishery activity located near OCSA 0557, and we welcome feedback specifically on that fishery interaction if there's feedback to offer. And again, we're specifically looking for feedback that would help us to further shape these lease areas as we move towards a lease sale. In terms of timing of the Central Atlantic lease sale, that's anticipated for summer of this year, summer of 2024. And then additionally, we are anticipating a second round of planning and leasing within the Central Atlantic region. Specifically, Maryland and North Carolina have indicated that the existing lease areas and anticipated lease areas are inadequate to meet their state's goals. So we are anticipating another round of planning and leasing to meet those goals, with a second lease sale occurring in the approximately 2025 to 2026 timeframe. So the next area that I'd like to cover is our work in the New York Bight region. So for the New York Bight, BOEM is developing a programmatic environmental impact statement, or a PEIS, to evaluate and describe potential impacts of expected offshore wind development in the New York Bight lease areas. This programmatic approach is really being considered to evaluate impacts at a regional level that then will be further refined through additional environmental review at the project-specific stage. So the programmatic EIS, or that PEIS, is really intended to serve as a first-tier environmental review document from which additional environmental analysis at sort of a second tier at the project-specific level will be conducted on each project's proposed construction and operations plan. One of the main focuses of this draft programmatic EIS is evaluating possible programmatic avoidance, minimization, mitigation, and monitoring measures, AMM measures, that BOEM may require as conditions of approval for activities proposed by lessees in their plans within the New York Bight. So specifically, we're seeking some feedback on those programmatic measures that might be applied for projects in the New York Bight region. Within the current comment period that is open now through February 26th, we are also seeking comments on important resources and issues, as well as potential impacts to the environment that should be particularly considered for the New York Bight. Again, the comment period is open now through February 26th. And alongside the open written comment period, we're holding several public meetings. We held a public meeting in New Bedford yesterday, particularly around fisheries issues. And we're holding two additional public meetings, one tonight in Stony Brook, New York, another tomorrow in Toms River, New Jersey. And then in addition to the in-person meetings, we're holding a virtual meeting on February 13th that we certainly encourage yours and others' participation in. So with that, I'll hand it back to Kirby.
Seth. So moving into the project-specific updates. Thanks. First up on the screen is the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind commercial lease. Reminder, this project's construction and operations plan had emphasizing had, outlined building 202 wind turbine generators approximately 24 nautical miles east of Virginia Beach in the exclusive economic zone. As part of the project's COP, an onshore switch station will be built north of Harper's Road in Virginia Beach. So following the Mid-Atlantic Council meeting in October of last year, on October 31st, the Department of Interior issued a record of decision with the preferred alternatives that are noted on the screen, notably decreasing the total number of wind turbines. So as outlined in the final environmental impact statement, starting first with the offshore elements, alternative B was selected. So this reduced the total number of wind turbine generators down from 202 to 176 and created an exclusion zone in an area known as Fish Haven along the northern boundary of the lease area. Fish Haven is a recreational fishing location, which I'm sure some of the Virginia Council members are aware of, where World War II ships and tires and other materials have been deposited since the 1970s to facilitate an artificial reef development. For the onshore component, alternative D1 was selected, which designates an interconnection cable route. There'll be approximately 14 miles long, running overhead along power line cables from north of Harper's Road to the new Harper's Switch Station. And that'll be located at the Naval Air Station Oshia parcel. So the COP was formally approved on January 28th, 2024. It's important to highlight that in the environmental impact statement, the adverse impacts to commercial and recreational fishing will be mitigated through a requirement for Dominion Energy to establish and implement a direct compensation program to provide monetary compensation to commercial and for-hire recreational fishermen impacted by the project, as well as a requirement for Dominion to maintain a fisheries gear loss claims procedure throughout the life of the project. So next is Empire Wind, which is on the screen. I'm updating from my colleague Ursula Housen's presentation in October. The record of decision was issued on November 21st of last year. A reminder, Empire Wind consists of two projects. So Empire Wind 1 will have 57 wind turbine generators with a 41 nautical mile long export cable planned to make landfall at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. And Empire Wind 2 will have a 90 wind turbine generators with a 26 nautical mile export cable with planned landfall at either Long Beach or Lido Beach, New York. So on the screen are the preferred alternatives that were selected. On the first two deal with the export cable routes for both projects. So for Empire Wind 1, within the vicinity of Gravesend Bay, alternative 1C, the cable will be buried to a depth of 15 feet below the charted water depth to reduce potential interactions between the cable and vessels navigating the Ambrose Navigation Channel. For the Empire Wind 2 project, the submarine export cable route will minimize impacts on the Sandborough area offshore Long Island, New York, by at least 500 meters. So this is alternative D. By avoiding crossing the Sandborough area, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will be able to undertake resiliency projects in a cost-effective manner and meet the demands for clean sand for these resiliency projects. So moving down to alternative F, this alternative addresses the findings of liconite deposits across the lease area that represent extreme difficulties for installation of fixed bottom foundations. Alternative G outlines that Empire Wind 2 will use an above water cable bridge adjacent to the Long Island Railway Bridge for the onshore export cable crossing at Barnum's Channel. Because the crossing will comprise of an existing parking lot on one end and a tank farm on the other side, impacts to wetlands and natural habitats on either side of the crossing will be avoided. And alternative H will use a clamshell dredging with an environmental bucket that will help reduce the discard of dredge materials compared to other dredging options. So with these alternatives incorporated into the COP, we are anticipating the COP approval towards the end of this month, likely on February 21st. So moving on to my next slide here, This is the fisheries mitigation guidance document slide, and staff have been given the green light to finalize this document. So that's a positive development from our last update in October. And while we do not have a set date yet on when that will be completed, we do anticipate it will be done later this year. As a reminder, this document is national in scope, so therefore the final document will not be specific to any one region of the U.S. And in terms of how BOEM is considering this topic in relation to active projects, it's important to note that even though the document is not finalized yet, we are including term and conditions in the construction and operation plans, also known as the COP approval for fisheries mitigation in several of these current projects. Another highlight to build off of the engagement with tribal nations last summer, the guidance document will acknowledge and note tribal treaty rights. And last, the guidance document, once it's completed and released, at a minimum, BOEM will hold a public meeting to discuss the changes made based on comments received on the draft document. Okay, so moving on to our last slide that we'll be providing an update on, I'm going to go quickly through an awarded fishery study that may be of interest to you all. In particular, the completed black sea bass, longfin, squid acoustic study. So some of the key findings that I thought might be useful for this group to hear is that for black sea bass in particular, the study investigated behavioral responses of black sea bass to replay pile driving signal patterns and frequencies, which found altered behavioral patterns during the sound exposure, which is when they were replaying this noise. Additionally, in a multivariate analysis indicated the changes in behavioral patterns underlie reduced activity, which showed itself in greater time spent, these animals sinking or pivoting or resting. Moving on to longfin squid, this is the first study to demonstrate behavioral effects of pile driving noise on any of these cephalopod species and focuses on commercially important squid species whose range overlaps with areas where marine construction projects involving pile driving will occur in the near future. So I would just kind of note, in summary for this study, overall the results indicate that for both species, responses to sounds are most likely to occur at the onset of noise, and rapid habituation is expected, with some resensitization, and reproductive behaviors may likely be relatively resilient to these noise stressors for Semiparus species that have a limited opportunity to reproduce. So that's a recently completed study. The two other listed ongoing studies, one is a nature inclusive design study, which is looking at the addition of more hardened structures in areas where there previously weren't. And the second one focuses on connectivity of these new structures across areas and how that may be impacting assemblages and ecosystem processes at a broader scale. Those two ongoing studies do not have a set date for completion yet, but if there's interest in getting more updates on them, we can happily provide that. So with that, I think that concludes our presentation for this morning, and happy to answer any other questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kirby. Thank you, Seth, for the presentation. Let me look around to members of the council for any questions they may have for Kirby or Seth. Eric?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. I just have a question about compensation. That process is pretty, applying for compensation, that's a pretty daunting task. There's a lot of paperwork and you have to compile all these records from back in time. And I just want to know, has BOEM ever considered setting up like a help desk? Some entity that can help fishermen navigate the process to just apply for compensation. Most of the stuff is in federal fisheries, so they have required documentation. But if you look at those forms, they're pretty daunting. So to me, what the industry would really benefit from was, 1-800 compensation or whatever you want to call it, and be able to get a hold of somebody, not a recording or somebody in a foreign country to help navigate that process. So would you ever consider doing that?
So I'll take a first stab at this and I'll say, being still new to BOEM, I can't speak to the extent of how that topic has been considered with developing this document, but it's a very interesting idea, one that I would like to ask our colleagues about and try to get some more information on. And I'm happy to follow up with you, Eric, as well as provide to the council if there's any other updates relative to that. But I think it's a fair and reasonable request.
Any other questions? Adam Nowalski.
Thank you. So regarding the survey on squid and sea bass, given some of the information that's in here, and let me quote from the background, there is mounting evidence that the increasing anthropogenic noise in the world's oceans can have a range of negative physiological and behavioral effects. While much of this focus has been aimed at marine mammals and protected species, fishes are also exposed to the same disturbances. And jumping down to the bottom, these impacts can have fundamental ecological and evolutionary implications for species, especially ones that rely on acoustics in key stages of their life, and can reduce fish populations and ecosystem functioning. Given that information, I'm wondering if there would be an opportunity for BOEM to present before this council, perhaps in conjunction with our partners such as ASMFC, maybe in August at a joint meeting, a deeper dive on this study. Not sure when the appropriate time for squid might be, but again, I might propose August for sea bass when we meet jointly with the commission on that species, so we can get some more information about what's actually in this study.
Yeah, thanks for that, Adam. And we're taking notes. Chris, I'll leave that up to Chris to see if we can get that on the calendar. But that's a great idea. And that, as a follow-up to Adam's question, so the study that you mentioned on squid and sea bass, that was based on pile driving. Has there been any additional work on, I know that there has been a lot of concern from the industry and fishermen about the cables as they're laid, whether or not there's going to be interference. And I don't know all the proper terms, but when the cable's laid and there's electricity running through those cables, has there been any recent studies about the effects that might have on fish and other aquatic organisms that are in that vicinity?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mr. Chair. I am not aware, but that doesn't mean it hasn't been undertaken. So what we can do is look into that on our end and see if there is any current studies that are being funded or if that's being targeted for the next, so to speak, round of funding that we do to further studies on, the impacts of these projects on marine environments. But
I could just add one point. We have funded some work out on the West Coast looking at EMF, electromagnetic field related interactions. So BOEM has supported some work in this space, and we've, within our environmental impact statements, evaluated some of those interactions. But we have heard in multiple conversations over the last year or years, a lot of interest in exploring these interactions further. So our environmental studies program is definitely a great avenue for us to pursue research along those lines. So that's certainly something we can follow up with you on in terms of existing research that we've supported and other research we're aware of, and then other future directions for funded work through our program.
Yeah, that was the word I was looking for.
Yeah, sure.
And that could be something, to Adam's point, maybe if we get a presentation down the road with a joint body with ASMFC, that could be something to tie into that. Are there any other? Yeah, go ahead, Kirby.
just as a follow-up, timing wise, to what Adam was suggesting in the fall or at least August actually is a very helpful one because we go through an annual process with the environmental studies program in terms of starting, so to speak, a solicitation request or putting that out there for people to consider submitting ideas. So that happens in the fall. And so teeing that up, a presentation that could hopefully help illuminate and provide more information to this council, maybe also the commission as well. But coming out of that, council members would be able to have the opportunity to submit ideas to BOEM or additional research ideas, as I'm saying, in the fall of this coming year.
Thanks, Kirby. Chris Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Kirby and Seth. I have a quick question about the fisheries mitigation guidance document. So Kirby, I didn't quite catch when that's going to be done. I heard someone's been given the go-ahead to finish it, but when is it going to be finished?
Yeah, so not to be squirrely about it, but we don't have a set date for when it will be published and released to the public. I do know in talking with our supervisors that it will be published this year. I just don't have a timeline in terms of when this year. But we're happy to give the council updates, either to staff or to you directly on when we're anticipating that to come out.
Okay, thank you. Any other council member questions? Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was curious if there's any program within BOEM or if they're planning to be any program within BOEM to standardize the ecological environmental sampling protocols and implementation for within wind areas, and if there's any type of oversight or audit system being put in place to make sure that the data is congruent with other surveys, or if it's still kind of as it was set before, where each survey is a runoff survey or a standalone survey that can't really be transposed to any other area besides that small communal area. Thank you.
So Robert, can I repeat your question so I'm making sure I'm understanding it correctly? Are you asking about surveys that the developers are conducting for these projects?
Yes, it would be the pre-construction survey, baseline survey, and the monitoring programs that'll be throughout the lifespan of the project.
And
Thank you for the question. So BOEM does have guidance documents associated with a range of surveys that are either required or typically associated with projects. I'd have to get back to you on specifically, what areas those existing guidance documents cover. But I would just offer that, we do have guidance around benthic surveys that's available and provided to developers ahead of their survey work, as well as guidance for other surveys. But in terms of, if there are specific areas that are where you're seeing gaps or where additional guidance you feel is necessary, we can certainly bring that forward to those that are developing that guidance and have them evaluate that.
Okay, one last question. I'm going to go to John Hare, and then we're going to switch to the next agenda or the next presenter. Go ahead, John.
Not a question, just a comment, Mr. Chair. I mean, in the past, we've had representatives from Europe here at the council talking with us about wind energy development, and there has been a lot of work done in Europe on both effects of noise and EMF. And so I think in terms of that, conversation in August, it could be good to sort of broaden the expertise that you're looking to. There is ICE's International Council for Exploration of the Sea working group on offshore wind and fisheries, and there's individuals within NOAA and in the American fisheries community that are parts of that working group, so we could reach out to them to see what information they could bring to us from Europe if that was one desired.
Okay, thanks, John. I do see some hands online. What I'd like to do is to move on at this point, the public, for the members of the public who are participating here in the room and online with us. There will be an opportunity. Hopefully, Kirby and Seth, you can stick around for a little while, and I'm sure there'll be questions as more of a panel discussion at the end of all of the presentations, but I do want to move on given the time. Okay, so next, and thank you, gentlemen, both for being here today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, our next presenter is Chris Olith, Executive Director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind. Welcome.
See, good morning. Good to see you, Mike. It's been a lot of years. Do you remember me from the Marco days?
I do, but
Good to
those,
see you.
I've forgotten many of those years.
Same. Yeah, I'm blocking them out. I had long hair and it wasn't gray then. So, great. Well, thanks for having me. And I feel like this is just a really salient time to be discussing a regional fisheries compensation fund based on what we just heard from the BOEM team. By way of background, my name is Chris Olith. I'm the director of an entity called the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind. We are a philanthropically funded independent organization that helps with the long-term sustainable and responsible development of offshore wind. We just entered our 10th year of working primarily at the behest of federal and state policymakers. And so how we came about working on this project was it was about almost 3 years ago now that we were contacted by a few of the states on the East Coast who said, this is, to points made earlier, these compensation programs are kind of complicated. And we're concerned that the fishing community would be overwhelmed with so many individual compensation programs. And could we figure out a way to develop a regional compensation framework? SIOW, as we're called, the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, have a history of working kind of across states to help bring forward creative solutions like this. And so we started working with a variety of the states on the East Coast. Right now, we're working with all the states from Maine to North Carolina on this potential program. And do I just ask you to move to the next slide? Is that how? Oh, I do it. Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry, I'm a little behind on technology this morning. 11 Atlantic coast states, and they're listed here, Maine to North Carolina. And the idea is this program would be applicable to any fishermen on the East Coast, regardless of where they were landing or home ported. But these are the 11 states who are participating in the program. We've reached out to South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, but since their offshore wind programs aren't quite as robust, they haven't actually joined the 11 states working group. But I am also doing an update for the Southern Council coming up in a couple months. So right now, SIOW is supporting the 11 states doing engagement with the fishing community and with the offshore wind developers with the idea that this is a co-designed process where, we are taking input from the fishing community, not just fishermen, but really up and downstream stakeholders in the fishing community. So that's a big role of what I've been doing at SIOW, also working along with a colleague from the Consensus Building Institute named Pat Field, who you may know. I call him the Kevin Bacon of offshore wind and fishing, because if offshore wind and fishing is happening, Pat's usually in the room. So he's been great in helping us bring the fishing community to the table. And again, this program started in 2021 after 9 of these 11 states sent a letter to the Biden administration saying, hey, we would love to really, we would love it if BOEM in particular would support regional compensation and regional mitigation programs. What the states learned after sending that letter was that BOEM, in fact, does not have the authority to establish a regional compensation fund, and nor did NOAA. And so the state said, okay, well, we'll step in here and, kind of fill that void. So we have been also engaging with BOEM and NOAA pretty regularly as well, since they will have integral roles, obviously, in this in the program. The state's objective in setting up this program, as stated, is to establish a credible regional administrator for managing and distributing fisheries compensatory mitigation funds for offshore wind for the U.S. Eastern Seaboard. And they've always been very clear in stating that mitigation should only be used once avoiding and minimizing have been exhausted. So those options, kind of thinking about that classic hierarchy of ways to mitigate, really avoiding and minimizing should be fully exhausted at the point that you get to mitigation. Right now, we are supporting the states in releasing an RFP to hire a third party to manage this fund. And this is an exciting milestone after about 2.5 years. We supported the state of New York, NYSERDA specifically, in writing this RFP, which will be released, we think, this month. So we're really at an important milestone as I speak with you. The idea is that, the first steps of this regional fund administrator coming on, or as we call it, the RFA, the regional fund administrator, is they will be the ones working through, and I'll talk about the governance structure, but working with the fishing community, with the offshore wind developers, the states and federal agencies to design and develop this regional fund program. The idea and really the scope that the states have been focusing on is what's outlined in that box that you see outlined. And while there are a ton of questions about how the money gets into the program, that is outside of the scope of what the states have been exploring, with the idea that, we know that this program will be fully seeded by developer deposits. But the states have really been focusing on how the money would be managed through a fiduciary, and then how the money will be doled out, which is the focus of this administrator who is, we're currently soliciting bids for. The money in program, while it's certainly very important and one that a lot of the fishing community asks questions about, that's, kind of handled on the BOEM side of things. And the way it's anticipated that to work is essentially when an offshore wind project goes through their construction and operation plan, they submit that plan, they go through the NEPA process. There will be, a determination through that process on the level of mitigation that would be required of an offshore wind project. And then instead of those dollars, like is the case with Vineyard Wind and South Fork, which are currently having their own compensation programs, I think you'll hear about today. Instead of that, those dollars essentially would be funneled directly to a regional fund, and the developers have strongly been supporting that approach. I think they recognize the efficiency and the expediency involved, and frankly, the financial savings, because each time they set up one of these programs, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars that could be dedicated to the fishing community and compensation, as opposed to all the administrative mishigas that goes into lawyers and all the things. So setting up one fund one time, I think most folks recognize as an efficient way of moving it forward. You'll see on the screen here the primary tasks of the fund administrator as have been outlined in the RFP that again will be released by NYSERDA, we think later this month. But essentially those are to design the program, and that's really where the rubber will meet the road, because that's when all the detailed claims form, the processes, the eligibility criteria, all of those items will be designed. And I'll talk in a minute about how the fishing community will be involved with that, as well as federal agencies. Then sharing that information, Eric, as you pointed out, there is a strong plan for whoever the regional fund administrator is to have not only a help desk, that is staffed by actual people in this country, who are local, but also to have online forms be able to submit it, emails, phone calls. At the beginning of when programs are stood up, typically these claims administrators actually have in-person offices in fishing communities, so that if it's New Bedford or Point Pleasant or like kind of the main fishing areas, you could actually walk in and talk to someone about how to submit a claim. So we're really excited about sharing of information and how that's going to happen. They would actually review the claim in the next step, verify the claim, and then we have been talking with various entities, including folks at the ASMFC, about the potential for there to be a way for payments to be made through someone outside of the claims administrator, maybe through the fiduciary who is actually holding the money. I mean, there's really a lot of details to be worked out, but just to give you a sense of like, the general flow of how we're anticipating this to be going. In terms of the developing the regional fund administrator program, we are currently at where you see that box on your slide. So we've gone through an RFI process where there was, strong engagement and feedback from the fishing community and the developers. The procurement, which is the RFP that's being released, is this, multi-sectoral joint decision process. In fact, the scoring committee that is going to be deciding on who the fund administrator is comprised of folks from the fishing community who have self-selected, as well as developers and states. So it's a multi-party scoring methodology that NYSERDA implements. And then we'll be heading into this design oversight committee, or DOC phase, where, and I'll just skip ahead to the next slide so you can see. I feel like I'm running late on time. So I just want to show you, I'll go back, but I want to show you, I think, the DOC composition, which is one of the most important, I think, aspects, is that this design oversight committee will be comprised of 3 states of the 11 who've been working, 3 developers, and again, likely that geographical mix, and then 6 members of the fishing community. We're thinking 2 in each of the kind of 3 regions on the East Coast, could be divided up by gear type or some other criteria. Right now, we're at a point where we would love to ask the council for feedback on how you would see the selection of this design oversight committee from the fishing community. We have already been speaking with the folks at NIMS about using their networks to advertise openings as part of the DOC, and wondering if we can ask the councils as well if that type of information you could circulate on our behalf, but essentially allowing 6 members of the fishing community to be a part of that design oversight committee. We also will have ex officio members from NIMS, from the ASMFC, BOEM, from the councils, if that was appropriate and something that you all would like to participate in. And then some liaisons in terms on the procurement side that would come through the state process. Just trying to keep an eye on the time. The way, and I'll just go back a couple slides. I feel like I should have had that slide earlier, so I apologize. But really looking at a bottom-up design and development approach here, the D&D approach, where kind of having this broader engagement of fisheries, narrowing down through ad hoc workshops, interviews, focus groups, and smaller group meetings, and then that all funnels into this design oversight committee, this DOC process. The key elements that we'll be asking the DOC to advise on, and these are huge portions of the compensation program: who is eligible, what evidence should be required, what is compensable, what are the multipliers that should be in place, what data sources and verification processes should be used, and what other qualities essentially would be important, like a simple, efficient, verifiable claims process. So the DOC, the role of the DOC will really be, I think, one of the most critical in our steps so far. And I think I forgot to say earlier that there was a governance committee that was set up, comprised of folks from the fishing community and the developers who are essentially who've developed this scope of work for the DOC and the composition of the DOC. So it's not something that, I'm just kind of making up or we're asserting. It's something that essentially has been developed jointly. But they have indicated that their scope should be to approve the key processes proposed by the regional fund administrator, so that the regional fund administrator is not out there doing this in a vacuum, to advise on the key elements of the claims process, and then also review the performance of the regional fund administrator to ensure that over time they're kind of doing what they said they would, and making sure that there are key milestones in the procurement process that are being met in order to make sure that all happens. The regional fund administrator themselves will be engaging in a robust stakeholder engagement plan. We will expect a stakeholder engagement plan as part of the RFP process. So once the bidders submit their program, they'll be submitting a stakeholder engagement plan, kind of explaining how they would bring stakeholders into the process, and certainly SIOW and CBI and the states will be there to kind of support that. But on the slide in front of you, we're kind of outlining what we would see as what we think would be key components of a stakeholder engagement program in terms of first engaging stakeholders on the process, engaging them on the substance, bringing those forward to the DOC for advice, and then, allowing comment periods before the program was finalized. Okay, we talked about that. The DOC selection process, again, each of the caucuses will select its own DOC members. So we're, asking for nominations from, in this case, the American for Clean Power, ACP, are the trade group for the developers, so that they are going to coordinate the offshore wind members. SIOW, the special initiative, will be coordinating on the state side, who will be part of the DOC. And so far, we have contacted Rhoda, and as mentioned, NOAA and others about making recommendations for the fishing side of things. Many folks have asked about the recreational for hire components, and while this program will, in fact, compensate for recreation for hire fishermen, it's right now essentially a small percentage of the total estimated lost revenues anticipated. So right now, we're not including the recreational community as part of the DOC selection. This is something that we had a lot of conversation about in the governance process, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. And we're, just looking for the proposers to outline a full approach on that stakeholdering. In terms of timeline and next steps, where we have been is that, we again kicked off in June of 2021, and then you'll see kind of the interim steps that have gotten us to this February 2024 launch of the RFP. An important milestone, I would say, was in the fall of last year when we secured, and we meaning the kind of joint stakeholder group, about $2.5 million to back the RFP that we'll be releasing through NYSERDA. These funds are available for the design and development of the program. $1 million of those dollars came from the offshore wind developers themselves. About 700,000 or so came from the states, the 11 states, and the balance of that came from fundraising that SIOW did from foundations. So we kind of came up through the sectors with about $2.5 million to pay for the design and development of the program. That will also include money to support fishing engagement, to compensate stakeholders for time and attendance and travel. Once those funds are exhausted and the fund is established, then the developers, essentially their compensation funds, the compensation fund will be seeded by the developer deposits to actually do the compensation. In terms of next steps, the RFP will be released this month is the current thinking, and I'm holding NYSERDA to that. We plan to actually bring the regional fund administrator on board to design and develop in the spring, and then undertake the fund design and development starting in the summer, but kind of, continuing through probably the balance of 12 to 18 months or so. So that's all I had for a presentation, and really appreciate the opportunity to share with you about, from someone who's been working in offshore wind for a really long time, something that I see as a really creative and solutions-oriented approach that the states are bringing forward, and happy to answer any questions or have any discussion as appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for being here. Let's see if council members have any questions. Is my mic working? Is it? Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just some noise here. So it is a little bit. Thank you for your presentation. Wondering the efficiency of the claims process. I come in with a simple claim or a moderately complex claim or a very complex claim. Have you had a discussion about timelines and the date that the claim is filed with when you want to see an end date to the claim is either approved or disapproved? And as two follow-ups, I would say that if you have a timeline on when you want claims approved, and you miss that timeline, is there an avenue for you or the administrator to ask for an extension? And/or if a claim is denied by a fisherman, is there an avenue for that, is there any relief? Is there anywhere else that fishermen can go for relief? And I can't think of the darn name, or an appeals process on that claim.
I'll need to get your contact information because I want you on the DOC because you're asking all the right questions. These are all the design elements that are not yet established. So I did say earlier, I'm going to feel like I have to say like, I don't know to a lot of questions because we haven't gotten to that stage yet. But I actually really would like to know your name. Would you mind telling me? I'm sorry.
My name's Peter Hughes.
Okay,
And I'll
Peter
be happy
Hughes.
to
Okay.
talk with you later.
Thank you. But those are the kind of things. So right now I've gone through identifying and interviewing claims administrators for entities who have done like big multi-hundreds of millions of dollars claims funds. And I've asked them these types of questions, like how do we make sure that, you know, we're doing right by the fishing community and what are they going to need? And they did explain how an appeals process worked. And since it's tax season, this analogy seems particularly appropriate. But in some cases, fishermen can elect to take what's like a standard deduction, and then you don't have to submit as much paperwork. So as you were saying, Peter, like some claims will be really complicated, but like, let's say you're just submitting a 1040 EZ, you know, can you just say, I want to take the standard deduction? This is kind of like how the Vineyard Wind program is working, I think, but they'll tell you more about it. But, you know, this way you don't have to like provide receipts and itemize everything along. Or if you feel like you have a more complicated claims program, you can take the, you know, more complicated application. But again, these are all things that we'll be working through, and I really appreciate the comments.
That's what you get for raising your hand, Peter. But don't let that take away from everyone else engaging in the conversation. And
Yeah, other ideas now are great. We love to hear them.
And if he tries to dodge you, I have cell phone, work phone, email. I've got it all for Peter. So just let me know. Any other questions? Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, Massachusetts and Rhode Island are starting this similar thing already. So what's going to happen to those programs once you guys get up and running? Are they just going to get folded into the greater project? Is that the plan there?
Well, it's not required, but it's something that we've been talking to the states about. It certainly could make the flow a lot more efficient instead of then having like one regional fund and then, you know, those funds for Rhode Island and Massachusetts that are separate, because those also wouldn't include like Revolution Wind and like other newer projects. So.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great if you took those programs over, only because you can standardize the claim forms.
Exactly.
As opposed to having, you know, one for each wind area.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that, to me, that's, and I appreciate the fact that you're going to have your little H&R Block offices all around.
Exactly.
So that would be
It's going to be good.
Okay, anyone else? Chris Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Chris, for the presentation. I have a quick question about the relationship between the DOC and regional administrator. So what's the intersection? What is that relationship?
Well, essentially, it's an advisory body to the regional fund administrator. We decided through and kind of this multi-sectoral stakeholder governance group that it wouldn't be reasonable to expect the regional fund administrator to not be able to have the final say in operations and say, okay, eligibility requirements need to be set as such in order to be able to operate an efficient fund. So they will have the kind of final call on things of that nature, but they will be having the input from these like 6 dedicated members from the fishing community of the DOC, 3 from the states and 3 from the offshore wind developers. There are points in the performance of the regional fund administrator where the DOC will evaluate their performance. So there is a hook where, you know, essentially they could, you know, cancel their contract if there was any, you know, essential malpractice there.
John Hare.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the question. I guess going to my comment, which is similar to the last comment I made, is, have you interviewed or talked with, fisheries in Europe about the claims processes that they have gone through and what lessons they would learn and what recommendations they would make to us? 'Cause I think they've been at it for 30+ years, and that we have strong connections there. We have working groups. And so I'm just curious if you have done that yet, or if you would be interested in sort of that external look at what you're thinking of doing.
Yes, we have done that in the early stages of when we were setting up the framework for the program. I think it would be really interesting, though, and I appreciate the idea to check back in with them now that we've gone through some progress. But we did publish what we call our scoping document, and where we kind of outlined some of that feedback and how we were responsive to the European stakeholders. But it's an excellent point, and I think it's a good time to check back in with those folks. And to your point earlier, John, the special initiative, we do like to support projects like knowledge exchange. And I believe you were saying earlier about the potential to have fishermen, kind of coming and speaking with the council again. And that's something maybe I'd follow up with you on SIOW sponsoring if that was appropriate. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try something a little bit different. Kirby and Seth, would you guys be able to step up to the table over here? And given, well, Chris, please stay there.
Not excused.
We had a couple questions from members of the public. And since your presentations were a little more overarching rather than project specific, I'd like to address those two questions. Maybe Kirby and Seth, maybe just grab a seat. I don't know that we're going to need to bring your presentations back up, but I just, at least to allow for the public to ask a question or two, and then we'll go to the project specific presentations. So I've got, I had James Fletcher. James, are you still with us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you can speak up just a little bit. We're having it's a little light.
Okay. The United National Fishermen proposed back when this was all getting going that anybody with a commercial fishing license would get a reduction in their electrical bill. And any business with a federal dealer permit or a state dealer permit would get a reduction in their power bill. And therefore, could that be considered? It was on the table 1.5 years or 2 years ago, and I've never seen it come back up. Rather than having all these other people making money, simply if you had a federal or state commercial fishing license, you got a reduction in your power bill. The dealers that had state or federal permits or could prove that they primarily handle seafood coming from the Atlantic Ocean would get a reduction. Can that be considered or discussed? Thank you for your time.
Thanks, James. I don't know that we'll have a specific, it was a comment. I think I'll speak for Seth and Kirby that we'll take that comment into consideration. I appreciate the comment though, James. Okay, I have 2 other members of the public, and then we'll move on to the project specific presentations. Tony Delernia.
Yeah, I just appreciate you calling on me. I lost my audio and I just had to sign back in to get it. My question regarding compensation is the compensation, if a vessel has to be modified to operate safely in the wind energy area, is that an item that would be covered under a compensation policy?
Currently, because the program has not yet fully been designed, we're not entirely sure what will be compensable. That's one of the critical questions that we'll be discussing in the design and development phase. But it is something that's been raised by the fishing community numerous times. So I would see that as like something that would be likely compensated, but we don't know exactly what will be compensated at this point.
Okay, well, building on that, following up on that, you had said earlier in your presentation that the for-hire fleet was, in a sense, not going to be fully represented on the compensation review board. And I would ask that you reconsider that, because if there might be certain modifications that have to be made to for-hire vessels that currently fish in those areas. And I would encourage you to include representatives from the for-hire industry in your review panels.
Thank you.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thanks, Tony. Good to hear your voice again. I'm going to go next to Annie Hawkins. And Lane, I'll come back to you after Annie. If you're speaking, Annie, we can't hear you. You're still on mute as far as what my screen's telling me.
And shoot, did that unmute it?
Yeah, you're unmuted now. We can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you. It showed like the moderator end. Anyway, thank you. I'm sorry about that. I just wanted to, Lane may actually say some of the things I know she's there that I was going to say, but I wanted to just provide a couple quick comments. I'm Annie Hawkins. I'm the executive director of ROTA. I saw, and thanks Chris for presenting this. I saw ROTA was on some of the slides, and I just wanted to provide a little bit of clarification, which is that, this process has been going on for a couple of years. The state of Virginia very graciously brought us ROTA in, primarily through Lane, to observe some parts of this process, and so we have been tracking it for the past few years, but ROTA is not currently supporting this model. We're kind of learning about it and helping get some information out to the fishing industry about it. Once the RFQ is on the street, we're going to provide some more meetings and conversations with fishing industry members to see if this is a model that we do support, that we should support going forward. My understanding was that the federal agencies are in ex officio roles. There's a lot more work needed, I think, to be done here to get the fishermen's input and the fishing industry input on this. It feels like a process where the other sectors have been far more active in this, although we have, of course, we appreciate that we have been brought in with ROTA and been able to engage to the extent that we have. But there's a lot of different activities going on, as some other folks have mentioned, with fisheries compensation. It's still not clear to us how this fits in with BOEM's development of mitigation guidelines. I personally sit on the board of the Rhode Island Fishermen Future Viability Trust that were created through the first few settlements. There's draft legislation out there with Congress. There hasn't been a lot of coordination between these efforts or among these efforts. I think a lot of the guys on the Rhode Island Trust Board were surprised to even hear this was happening. So I think, to Mr. Reed's question as well, and Mr. Hughes, we need a lot more coordination with what's going on, a lot more communication about what's going on, and figure out how this is going to fit in, if this is the model going forward. And just to say, this has been a ROTA position all along, but this is a project that is intended to be beneficial to the fishing industry, to mitigate, to make up for some of the impacts from offshore wind. And the outcomes here really need to be fishermen driven. We need just folks to weigh in, the councils to weigh in, and NIMS and the fisheries experts, the state agency experts as well, on how this is going to work to actually solve the problem it's intended to solve, which is to say to reduce those impacts, or to partially use money to make up for the impacts from offshore wind. So we look forward to continuing to work with you all on this and hearing about if this is something that the fishing community is going to support, and where we go from here. So I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Appreciate that. Lane, you want to step up to the mic right in the middle there? Or either one's fine.
Good morning. I'm Lane Johnston. I'm the programs manager for ROTA. So I won't repeat what Annie said. I just wanted to just provide one more thought, and apologize for my tardiness. I was listening to the meeting, but I took the orange line in the wrong direction. So as Annie mentioned, we have ROTA, myself in particular, has been part of the conversations and the process. We were one voice among several. So I think there's more work to be done to make it a truly perfect effort for the fishing industry. I think we have a way to go. So, and we have received direction from our members so far to continue following the process and engaging as much as we can. That being said, we are at a point where we'd like to check back in with our members, and if other members of the fishing industry want to join our meetings, they're always open to kind of see what role Rhoda should continue to play. This is particularly important for that DOC question. Chris and Pat have reached out to us to see if we'd be willing to help coordinate those DOC seats. And we are waiting to hear from our members and others if this is an appropriate role for us to take. Should we get that indication, we wouldn't restrict any seats to just Rota members. Again, it's like the fishing industry is much wider than just me and Annie and the people on our board, so we'd want to open it up to others besides Rota membership should we be told that that's an appropriate role for us to take. And yeah, as we said, we're kind of just tracking this, and by participating, we're not endorsing anything, our members aren't endorsing anything, but we are think it's important that we're at least at the table, part of the conversation. So I'll be here over lunch too if people want to talk to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Lane. Hopefully you did not end up in New Carrollton before you realized. Okay. Okay, Chris, Seth, Kirby, thank you. I think at this point, we're going to turn to some of the project-specific discussions and presentations. And our first presenter is Emily Rochon, Senior Manager, Strategic Implementation, Vineyard Offshore. I believe Emily is participating virtually with us today.
Correct.
There you
Can you
go.
hear
We
me?
can hear you just fine. Whenever you're ready, Emily.
Great. So am I controlling my slides?
I'll
That's-
control them. Just let me know when you need to go to the next
Okay,
slide.
great. Super. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Apologies for not being able to be there in person today. My name is Emily Rochon. I work for both Vineyard Wind and Vineyard Offshore. And as noted in the introduction, I'm a Senior Manager of Strategic Implementation, working on a variety of things for both companies on fisheries work. Next slide, please. So Vineyard Wind 1 is an 800 megawatt project that is currently being constructed about 15 miles south of Martha's Vineyard in lease area OCS-A 0501 or 501 for short. That project has completed the permitting process, and through the permitting process, several compensatory mitigation funds were established for the commercial fishermen potentially impacted by the project, and a summary of those funds is here on this slide. The Rhode Island and Massachusetts funds were established through the Coastal Zone Management Act process because both states had jurisdiction through the CZMA. And then the other state's fund was a voluntary fund that Vineyard Wind created through the project's permitting process. You can see that the monies are allocated and divided up differently, largely a result of the negotiation process with the state. So CRMC in Rhode Island and CZM in Massachusetts. There's $4.2 million available over the life of the project that will be paid out to fishermen potentially impacted by the project in Rhode Island, $19.1 million to fishermen potentially impacted by the project in Massachusetts, and then a combined $3.3 million for fishermen in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. Next slide, please. We spent over 2 years creating this fisheries compensation program. It's been quite a process. We've learned a lot along the way, but really at its heart, our objectives in creating this program was to ensure that the program itself was fair, simple, and transparent, that we limited the administrative burden for all parties, so commercial fishermen as well as the third-party administrator and anyone else participating in the process. At the same time, we thought it was very important to reduce the potential for gaming and fraud opportunities. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, if not all of you are aware, there's a lot of limitations in the data that's available to demonstrate potential harm or issues or impacts from an offshore wind project. So to the extent we encountered those data limitations in creating this program, we resolved to rule in favor of the fishermen anytime we came across one of those issues. And you'll see several ways in which we've done that throughout this presentation. There's a lot in this program, and I have 12 minutes to talk to you, so I'm not able to cover every aspect of the program. So I'm really focusing today on the commercial fisheries aspect of the program in the lease area. So the OECC portion of the program, and you'll see on your screen the yellow line that goes from the lease area to Coble's Beach and Barnstable. That portion of the program ran earlier this last year when we were doing the offshore installation for the cable. That portion of the program is now concluded. There's no separate payments for the operations phase. However, if fishermen snag their gear on any of the mattress protection that is used on the cable, there's a separate gear loss compensation procedure for them. So they are not shut out from compensation in the event that there's an issue during the operation phase for the cable. But really we're talking about just the lease area. So where the wind turbines are being installed, they're currently being installed, that portion of the program. There's also a separate portion of the program for shoreside businesses in Massachusetts. I won't be discussing that today. And information about that portion of the program will be available on the program website once it is. So for now, I think the most salient of information for this group are that the program we're going to be launching it on March 4th of this year. So in a little less than a month. There'll be a 90-day eligibility period within which fishermen will need to qualify in order to receive payments from the program. This is a one-time only deal, so everybody gets in the door at the outset, and then they are qualified for the life of the program as long as they're continuing to fish. To help fishermen qualify for the program, including providing them assistance with completing their applications and answering any questions, we're hosting 2 open houses in March. You can see the information for those open houses on the screen here. So one in Rhode Island, one in New Bedford. We will also be tabling at the Massachusetts Lobstermen's Association's annual meeting on March 22nd in Hyannis, and will be available for any questions. We're very committed to ensuring that any fisherman that is qualified for the program qualifies for the program. So if we need to provide additional assistance or support, our fisheries liaison, Krista Bank, and her team will continue to be available to provide that assistance, and I'll be sort of behind the scenes assisting them as needed. We've set up a separate website for this program, which is vw1fisheriescomp.com. That program, or that website, and the entire program itself is being run by a third-party administrator. So Vineyard Wind will not be involved in the active management of the program. We will not be reviewing applications. We will not be making eligibility determinations, and we will not be deciding how much money fishermen are paid. Next slide, please. So key components of the program, I've touched on some of this already. So as I said, we have a third-party administrator who's going to be running the program for the life of the program, which continues until the Vineyard Wind 1 project is decommissioned. We selected this third-party administrator through a competitive RFP process. We also have, as part of our program, fisheries advisors who will be supporting the third-party administrator and qualifying eligible fishermen for the program. So we have one fishery advisor from the fixed gear sector and another fishery advisor from the mobile gear sector. As I stated in the opening, the program is open to commercial fishing vessel owners and lessees in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island, who can demonstrate that they have previously fished in our lease area. I'll go into this piece in a little bit more detail in a subsequent slide. And also, as I mentioned earlier, in Massachusetts, there is an onshore dealer component of the program. We're not going to be discussing that today, and additional information on that aspect of the program will be available at a later date. I think one of the key things to be aware of with this program is, in order to qualify for the program and receive payments from the program, you do not need to show harm. So a normal claims-based procedure would be something along the lines of, but for your wind turbines, I would have earned X dollars and instead I earned Y dollars. We have dispensed with any harm requirement in the program. The reason for this was we discovered early on in the process that there really was no way for fishermen to show that our wind farm caused them to lose income. There's a number of confounding factors that get in the way of that. There's significant data limitations. There's confidentiality concerns around the data that are available. And then, of course, there are other wind farms that will be constructed after Vineyard Wind 1 is up and running. And so how is one wind farm more responsible or less responsible than another? So for all of those reasons, we dispense with the harm component entirely. The only thing you need to show to qualify for the program is that you have previously fished in our lease area. As I stated on the previous slide, and I'll state again, in order to receive payments from the program, you have to qualify during the eligibility period. And that is going to be the 90-day period that starts when the program is launched on March 4th. And, again, I will also just reiterate that Vineyard Wind, the company, myself, others in the team, we are not involved in the administration of the program. It is a third-party administrator who's running that program with support from the fisheries advisors. Next slide. So how to qualify? We have set up a website. Our third-party administrator has set up a website with an online application that fishermen will need to complete and submit within the eligibility period in order to qualify for the program. What you see on this slide here is the information that the fishermen will be required to provide in order to qualify for the program. Some of this stuff is very straightforward. Other parts of it are a little bit more complicated. So down to the fourth bullet, so in lieu of the harm component, you have to show that you have fished in our lease area for at least 3 years between 2016 and 2017. I have the next slide will get a little bit more into what that proof looks like in terms of what fishermen may be asked to submit to the program to qualify. And then the next piece of it is you also have to submit revenue from fishing activities from at least 3 years between 2016 and 2022, excuse me. And to be clear here, this last requirement is not, we're not asking fishermen to provide data or revenue data that shows this is the amount of money I earned from the lease area. Their fishermen are being asked to provide their total either gross annual revenue or net annual revenue in any 1 year. So we have dispensed with the requirement of needing to show that I earned 10,000 or 25,000 or more from the lease area, again, because our understanding in developing this program was that data limitations really make this very difficult, if not impossible, for most fisheries. So we're going with an annual net revenue for our gross revenue. Fishermen can submit one or the other, just overall. And that the hope of that is that it's made it a little bit easier for fishermen to actually demonstrate their earnings, and then the third-party administrator will use that information in order to determine the payment level. Next slide. So in terms of fishing activity documentation, the program itself is quite flexible in what it will accept. We are aware of different fisheries track their fishing activities in different ways. And so this list here is an example of some of the information that fishermen can provide with their application in order to demonstrate that they have historical fishing activities in the lease area. There is other trip level reporting information or other evidence that the program would accept. This data and information will be reviewed by the fishery advisors to confirm, yes, this fisherman has met the criteria for the program and has demonstrated that he or she fishes in the lease area, or no, they have not. And so this information will all be available on the website. We've had a conversation with NIMS about a week or so ago, and we'll be providing additional information on the website about who at NIMS to reach out to if you want to request specific data from them. So that is something that is coming as well, just to be aware of. We're working with them and coordinating with them to make sure that they're not overwhelmed with data requests, and that the data requests that may come from fishermen are as sort of efficient as possible. So that's just another piece to be aware of. And then once all of that information is received, the third-party administrator will receive the information. They will review the application first to determine that the application is complete. If the application is complete, then the third-party administrator will render a determination. If the application is not complete, the applicant will be notified and have an opportunity to correct any deficiencies in an application. And then once those deficiencies are corrected, the third-party administrator will render a determination on the applicant's eligibility. If an applicant is eligible, they will be offered what we're calling an expedited payment based on what their annual net revenues are. The fisherman can choose to accept that expedited payment or elect to go through an individual compensation review process. Through that additional process, if a fisherman elects to go through that process, the threshold there is that they will need to demonstrate that they rely on the lease area for their revenue more than the payment that was offered to them reflects. So there would be additional documentation perhaps that a fisherman could provide to demonstrate that. But that is an optional process that fishermen can elect to go through if they think that the payment that has been offered to them through the expedited payment process is not adequate. The expedited payment will be available to fishermen for 5 years, which means they will receive that payment for 5 years. They do not have to do anything aside from filing taxes to receive those payments. And then year 5, the third-party administrator will reach out to the fisherman and say, hey, are you still fishing? And the fisherman will need to say, yes, I am still fishing, and provide some evidence of that. And that is just evidence that the fisherman is still fishing. It's not fishing in our lease area. It's not fishing in New England. It's just fishing. And provided that the fisherman is able to demonstrate that he or she is still fishing, then they will then get another 5 years of payment. And so that will continue throughout the life of the program until the project is either decommissioned or a fisherman stops fishing. And so next slide, please. As I said, there's a lot of information in this program, and it's impossible to cover it all in 12 minutes. So this is a screenshot of the website that has been created for the Vineyard Wind 1 Fisheries Compensatory Mitigation Program. You can put your email into the box on the website and stay updated. You'll get an email once the program launches. And then once the program launches, the website should include almost all, if not all, of the information needed to understand how to participate in the process, how to qualify for the program. There'll be FAQs on the website. There's a very straightforward online application to complete. And so we encourage everyone just to sign up and get the notifications for the program launches on March 4th, and then go to the website when it's available to receive any information that they may need. And of course, the third-party administrator will be available to answer any questions anybody has along the way. And I think that's it for my 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Emily. Appreciate that. I'll take maybe one question or perhaps comment, but then I'd like to move on given the time. Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. I'd like you to expand on the 90-day eligibility period. Is that a 90-day period once a year on an annual basis, or is that a 90-day period from the day that I have an interaction with something and I need mitigation, and I have 90 days from the date of that interaction with something, and that I have 90 days to submit a claim?
It is a 90-day period from March 4th, 2024. It is the one and only time fishermen will have the opportunity to qualify for the program, because fishermen are not being required to demonstrate harm. There isn't a subsequent period where a fisherman, if they have an interaction with something in the wind farm, that they would then submit a claim. There's a separate gear loss claims procedure. So if a fisherman does, for example, snag a net on scour protection in the lease area, they can submit a claim to our gear loss claims protocol, which is separate from the Fisheries Compensatory Mitigation Program. So they wouldn't be shut out from being compensated in that instance, but for the economic loss associated with the construction operation project, there is a single 90-day qualification eligibility period, and that is happening in 2024, and it starts on March 4th.
Thank you for that information. My other question is that you have to have fished in Vineyard 1 lease site for at least 3 years between 2016 and 2022. Last I checked, fish had tails and they are migratory and that they move into certain areas. There are regime shifts. There are regime expansions of fisheries. And a little example is black sea bass. Black sea bass 10 years ago was probably, it was probably a foreign species to New Englanders who caught that species of fish. And now that range expansion has taken to the point where they're catching quite a few black sea bass up there. What if that area is filled with black sea bass and fishermen are unable to access the area to where the fish that they make their living on are now located?
Well, so for the recognizing that fish have tails, to qualify for the program, you have to show for 3 of 7 years that you fished in the lease area. So recognizing that fishermen may not fish in the lease area every year. That's why it's 3 of 7 years. And we're only doing the eligibility period once. So fishermen, otherwise, so we have a baseline of this is what fishermen earned in the lease area before the project was constructed. And then we use that to calculate what the payment level is. Once the project is constructed, if fish move into that area and otherwise fishermen are unable to access it, the program right now does not have a mechanism to compensate fishermen who may lose income as a result of fish migration.
Okay, thanks, Emily. If you have any boards or committees or any extracurricular work you need, Peter's definitely up for the task. So, okay, with that, Emily, I hope you can stay with us for just a bit so we can get through the next 2 presenters that we have. And then I'll open up the floor to members of the council and to the public for questions regarding the project-specific presentations. Our next presenters are with Kitty Hawk Wind. We have Leela and John. You guys want to grab a seat, and the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Chairman and the council. Thank you for having us here today. This has been an opportunity that we've been looking forward to. Is that better?
You can just angle the microphone moves around. If you, there you go.
Perfect.
That'll be better.
I'll lean in a little bit as well. We'll be brief. This is going to be a project update for us. But again, my name's John Harker. I'm the lead for the Fisheries Outreach Coordination for the Kitty Hawk project, along with the rest of the portfolio for Avangrid up in New England and future business. I'll pass it over to Leela.
Yeah, my name is Leela Schlinker. I'm the fisheries liaison for Kitty Hawk Wind, and I'm based in the Outer Banks. And great to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Perfect. So if you're not aware, excuse me, the Kitty Hawk lease is about 27 miles off of Corolla Beach. It's a rather large lease with a capacity of 3,500 megawatts. It's split right now into 2 separate lease areas, and this is something of a relatively new development. We have OCC 559. That's going to be now Kitty Hawk North. It's going to encompass about 33% of the entire lease area, with Kitty Hawk South then being 67%, and that's the original lease number of 508. This lease did come online in 2017, which we'll get into next with kind of some milestones. But just as an overview, this lease is about 37 miles from Rudy Inlet and about 34 miles from Oregon Inlet, and again, directly off of Corolla Beach. Next slide, please. What we have here is just some really brief, and again, in the slides, you can see a little bit more of the details, but some brief benchmarks, past and future, that we're looking at for Kitty Hawk North and associated Kitty Hawk South. Again, the lease was awarded in March 2017, so it is one of kind of the original leases that had been coming up. And the site assessment plan and the COP were submitted in 2020 with the anticipated ROD of December 2025. And at earliest, we're looking at a potential construction of North 2027.
Okay, so I do want to highlight some of the work that we have done and that is coming up to work with fishermen and thinking particularly about just utilizing historical fisheries knowledge and experience. So shortly after this lease was acquired by Avangrid, folks working at the time were very quick to start interviewing captains and analyzing landings data. So that's something we're still continuing to do, basically to understand the fishing activity. There is fairly limited fishing activity within the lease area, though there is some, in particular, some trawling. So in speaking with captains, one of the things that we did to accommodate that was to position the turbines to accommodate historical trawl tow directionality. I also wanted to note the spacing, which is about a nautical mile in either direction, which should give folks plenty of room to maneuver and fish throughout the lease. There is going to be no restrictions on recreational commercial fishing, except for during active construction, where we will have a sort of safety zone around the installation vessels. And those cables will be buried 5 to 8 feet in the stable seafloor. So what that means is not necessarily just 5 to 8 feet deep, but 5 to 8 feet below where we determine that stable seafloor is, so where that sand is not shifting around. And the idea there is that any gear types would be welcome and able to operate in the lease. So I did want to illustrate as well with these photos what we know from previous projects, and these are photos from the Dominion CVOW test turbines. So you can see just in 2 years, between 2020 and 2022, just the colonization or the reef effect that happens on these turbines. So that's something that we anticipate, sort of a consistent factor between these wind areas. But really, we see these rapid colonization by all kinds of barnacles, mussels, brittle stars, all sorts of creatures that provide food and opportunities for more migratory species and reef-living fish. So we are hoping that this will provide an opportunity for our recreational and commercial fishers.
Sorry, we're flip-flopping back and forth a little bit, but one of the things that has come up of late in particular is this notion of lack of communication from the developers, especially on our projects. And I wanted to address that in this slide and give somewhat, as we call, kind of the layers that we've incorporated into our communication plan, our fisheries communication plan, which is published on our website for our project and our others. But again, these layers are really important to us because it gives us the best extent of our ability, engagement with the fishing communities and all the other, again, layers that kind of subsequently move off of that. And outreach starts with us with trying to get in front of as many people as possible. Luckily, with the Virginia, North Carolina area, we do use sponsorships, fishing events where we're going to get hundreds and even thousands of people. And you can see we've kind of hyper-focused and strategized on using these four on the screen because they do yield the best kind of interaction that we can have. But moreover, I think one of our most important and integral parts of our communication plan is using fishing representatives. And those are used and defined differently, I think, sometimes throughout developers, but all in all, they have the same notion of not so much working for the developer, but they're contracted by developers to represent and advocate for their fishing community. And as you can see, we have two for North Carolina. Dewey, we wish he could have been here today. I know he's sick. And Hank Beasley, which are out in Outer Banks. And then we have Daniel LeGrand, who is up off of Rudy Inlet. So we have some coverage with some two-way communication, which is vital for us with the fishing representatives. We project information down to them so they can kind of communicate that through their fishing industries, and then reversely, that information comes back to us. Also, with future collaborations, we're looking at how can we create opportunities with the fishing communities in the future. Whether that could be some of the same practices that we have up in New England, where we use commercial fishing vessels for scout work, safety vessels during pre-construction cable laying, survey work, or moreover, if there's going to be opportunities outside of that to be incorporated inside science programs. And we'll talk about that in our next slide, where the fishing community can be involved, and we're highly supporting that. And lastly, I don't think I need to talk about the regional compensation program too much. Everyone is given some great representation on that from Boehm and Chris. But I will say that Avangrid is actively involved and has been since its inception of our conceptual ideas of this, and support the regional compensation program. And lastly, please, any questions, any of this information, if you'd like a follow-up, we're going to be here for the rest of the day, and then please visit the Kitty Hawk website.
Okay, so just to very briefly highlight our completed research. So in about We had 2 buoys offshore within the lease area from about 2020 to 2022. So when those buoys were deployed, they were collecting wind, current, and wave data, a lot of other meteorological data. We also shared that data real time on our website, which was very popular with the fishing community, and people actually reached out to us when the buoys were decommissioned to sort of ask if they could come back out. We've also completed some geographical or geophysical and geotechnical surveys to map the seafloor and get some idea of the sediment composition for the lease area. Currently, we don't have any upcoming surveys planned, but we will update fishermen and mariners in general through our website when those are coming online. So the image that you see on the bottom right just provides some information about some of the protections that we take during these surveys. I also have that as a handout with me, so if anyone would like that, I'm more than happy to share that information so you can kind of have a closer look at it. What I really want to highlight in particular is we're in the very beginning stages of looking at our fisheries monitoring plan, and so we kicked that off with a workshop this December in 2023 that we had down at Duke University. So the purpose of that was to bring together, as a first step, the research community to think about and strategize what research questions they would like to see answered with a fisheries monitoring plan. We also had 2 of our fisheries representatives there, Dewey and Hank were there. And in an effort to kind of be transparent and collaborative, we invited several of the other developers. So we had folks from the CVOW project and from the Carolina Long Bay project in attendance, as well as someone from the Nature Conservancy. And so kind of in that spirit going forward, one of our goals is to really be as transparent as we can about our process. And so we'll be sharing kind of the documents that come out of these working groups on our website. So for this first meeting, it was targeted mainly at the research community. We had participation from folks from 5 different universities, primarily present in person. And we are already in conversations with NOAA Fisheries, primarily to sort of talk about how we can interface with their existing surveys and potential future surveys. And we are planning our first kind of input from fishers starting, we're targeting probably an April date in the Outer Banks and potentially Virginia Beach as well. So if you know anyone that's interested in participating in that, please have them reach out. And this is another, as John mentioned, opportunity for us to partner with some of the fishers in the area where we hope that these surveys will be able to kind of partner with vessels and captains to get that work done. So with that, I do want to share both John and my contact information, as well as highlight our website and our social media. We will be here for the duration of the day, so please come chat with us. I'd love to give you my business card and have conversations with folks, but we really appreciate the opportunity to present, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you both very much, and it's great to hear that Dewey is working with you guys. He's a great asset and resource, hopefully that will help with your project. Are there any questions for John or Leila at this time? Ken, go ahead.
Leila, were you John Graves' grad student?
Yeah, it's good to see you again, Ken.
Okay, all right. I thought she fished with me. I just hadn't seen her.
Caught some pretty white marlin on your boat.
Yes, that wasn't a question. I just thought I recognized her, but I wasn't sure. Nice seeing you.
Good to see you.
It gets worse with age, Ken. It gets worse with age. Any other questions? Are there any members online? We're going to hold off on the public comment questions until after the last presenter at this time, but there'll be an opportunity for the public to weigh in. We're doing well on time, as long as Rick doesn't go well over his allotted time with the council. So I don't see any other questions at this time. So John and Leila, thank you. Hopefully you can hang around for a bit, and I might call you back up to the table here when we get to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Our last presenter is presenting on community offshore wind. We have former council member and former chair of the council, Rick Robbins. And I just looked online, Rick. Is Deirdre joining us online? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm not sure. She may monitor online. I'll be presenting today.
Okay, great. It's all you?
Yeah, and with the chair's forewarning that it might be a little bit long-winded, I'll try to be succinct today. But it's great to be with you, Mr. Chair and members. Real pleasure to be here at the council, and appreciate the council's invitation to provide a quick update on the Community Offshore Wind Project. Community Offshore Wind, by way of introduction, is a joint venture between RWE and National Grid Ventures, bringing together two companies with specialized expertise in the development of offshore wind projects around the world and transmission. National Grid Ventures serves over 20 million people in New York and Massachusetts, with 5,000 employees in New York. And their legacy companies have operated in New York for over 125 years. RWE has developed 19 offshore wind projects successfully globally. We have a commitment as a company to net zero by 2040, and we have a commitment that I hope to touch on at the end of the presentation to achieving biodiversity net positive outcomes on all new projects by 2030. RWE has 3 seabed leases in the U.S. We have one offshore in New Jersey I'll be talking about today. We have one off the north coast of California, and we have a third one in the Gulf of Mexico. So lease 539 is located 32 nautical miles east of Barnegat Light, New Jersey, 56 nautical miles south-southeast of Jones Inlet, New York. The lease is about 149 square nautical miles. It's expected to yield over 3 gigawatts of power. We anticipate up to 3 electrically isolated projects to be constructed in the lease area with interconnection into New York and potentially New Jersey. These may be permitted through one or more construction and operations plans. Our fisheries team, you've met our team before. We are very excited today to announce that Sean Lucy has joined our team. Dr. Lucy has extensive experience with the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, 15 years as a research biologist developing ecosystem approaches to management, and 10 years leading the Northeast Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Program. Sean brings extensive scientific expertise and bandwidth to the team. He'll be serving as an East Coast Fisheries liaison. He'll also be actively engaged in our monitoring and research work on the fisheries side. We're very excited to have him join the team. He joins Deirdre Bulkey and Michelle Duval and myself. We all have long backgrounds in state and federal fisheries management and in fisheries development and cooperative research. So we are excited to be working in this space, recognizing its importance and the challenges that are unique to it. But we certainly hope to bring all of our collective experiences gained through our fisheries management experiences to the process. I have this up. I'm not going to run through all the details of our commitments that were made in the NYSERDA award, but I have this slide up to call your attention to the point of interconnection there at the Con Edison Clean Energy Hub in Brooklyn. I will note that we've made a lot of commitments in this award, and part of this reflects some of the identified challenges or impediments to people entering the workforce as offshore wind energy develops. So you see a $10 million investment for childcare for offshore wind workers and trainees. That was identified as a significant hurdle and need. We also have a commitment to $41 million in workforce development. We're in the business of developing clean power at scale. I think this one metric illustrates that. You see a projected 5% emissions reduction from this project for New York State's power sector. So at the end of the day, we hope to be delivering clean power at scale at a level that makes a difference. This is a quick look at our project timeline. We are in the early stages of the planning phase, so that'll run through 2026. That includes our site investigation work, construction and operations plan development, et cetera. Then we'd move into construction as early as 2027 through 2030 with a delivery date in 2030 for the operational phase of the project that would extend through 2063. At the end of that period, we would either develop a plan to extend the lease or develop a decommissioning plan and submit that in advance to BOEM. We're also interested in some of the life cycle recycling. I'll touch on that in a minute. On engagement, our team's been broadly engaged in community engagement. We've been supporting oyster restoration projects and beach cleanup. We've also been engaged in STEM education support. On the fisheries side, we've had a couple of initiatives that our team's been very excited about. We've donated over tens of thousands of locally caught and locally processed seafood meals to food banks. We've had a couple of big initiatives around that at the holidays, and that's been a very rewarding project for us to have the opportunity to participate in. Another one, that picture top right, was probably one of my best days at work ever. We got to take a bunch of children from an underserved school out fishing. Many of them caught their very first fish that day. And I can't tell you how much of a privilege that was for us. On the regional science side, we're active. We're engaged in the ROSA Advisory Council. We're the first developer now to join as a member of the SCIMFISH, which is Science Center for Marine Fisheries. And we're excited to be supporting our first project on that, oriented around surf clam enhancement. We've also had the opportunity to work with Dr. Hare and his team at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to develop a Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, or a CRADA, to support the development of our monitoring plan and strategies for federal fisheries mitigation. In terms of our site assessment work, so earlier Chris Olaf talked about the approach for fisheries compensatory mitigation. We are actively engaged in trying to avoid and minimize impacts as we go through our work. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that we do. So we take a layered and stepwise approach to developing our survey plans. To do that, we start with a risk assessment, and that'll be informed by local knowledge to understand the spatial and temporal distribution of particularly fixed fishing gear. And then we work to use that to enhance our export cable routing and integrate that local knowledge, and then try to modify potential export cable survey routes using that information to avoid impacts and avoid delays to survey work. On the communication and outreach side, our fisheries team is on the phone every day with the survey vessels, so we maintain a close finger on that pulse of activity. We also have one-on-one outreach with fishermen as needed to facilitate coordination to get through the areas that might have fishing gear in them. And we also coordinate with the fisheries service and other survey PIs to coordinate our work with regional fisheries surveys. We use a scout vessel as needed to make sure an area, or to get a baseline of information on fishing gear in an area, and then achieve any coordination that we need to by contacting individual fishermen. We also have onboard fisheries liaisons. They play a really important role in the sort of finer scale coordination at sea between our survey operations and the fisheries. I have a few quotes up here I want to run through quickly, but this is Lynn Gerchuk in the photo. There's nothing average about Lynn. Lynn's had decades of experience in the commercial fisheries. He's an exceptional professional in his role as an onboard liaison, and he has to deal with all sorts of different situations. So whether it's interaction with the recreational fleet, commercial fleet, sailboats, et cetera. But just wanted to give you a quick sense of what this looks like. So these are excerpts from Lynn's reports that we get every day. And the first one, he indicates that once they finished up in the export cable corridor route and were transiting back to the lease, they had less than a 0.3 nautical mile closest point of approach with a clam boat. Since they were transiting to the next line, I hailed the captain on VHF 16, switched up to 17 to offer to take his stern, or move more to the west to give him more room. He informed me he'd be turning soon and we could hold our course. You can look at the one bottom left, it's the same thing. It's giving a few spokes, getting a few spokes. I mean, this is the way he works out this fine scale coordination with the fleet. Bottom right, at 6:55, we had a sailboat 1 nautical mile off our starboard bow that was transiting north at 2 knots while we were transiting west at 5.2. We had a close CPA. I hailed the sailing vessel on 16, switched up to 18 and spoke with the captain. I informed her we'd be on our course for another 1.5 miles and requested she alter to starboard for safe passage. She informed me that she was unable to steer the vessel while her husband was sleeping. She also volunteered to wake him up to get the engines going. I informed her that would not be necessary and we would turn around and give way to her vessel. She was appreciative of that, and we were able to turn around and allow her to continue on her course. A lot of give and take out there, but that fine scale coordination really comes into play to achieving safe outcomes out there. And I can tell you, Lynn's had to handle situations that you couldn't possibly train for. He sees a little bit of everything out there. I want to give credit to the clam fleet, though. Lynn is professional in his communications. The clam boat captains have reciprocated with professional communications and coordination and cooperation. And that's the fleet that we interact with the most on a day-to-day basis out there. And they deserve credit for that. Quickly, our site investigation update, our geophysical, the punchline on all this is that we're wrapping up our main campaigns on geophysical and geotechnical in Benthic. The current survey work we're doing on geophysical is expected to conclude in May. Benthic expected to conclude in March, so next month. Geotechnical expected to also conclude next month. I wanted to show you quickly to give you a sense of what we get to see. These two images are side scan images, and these reflect clam dredge marks, and these are just 6 days apart. So top right, that's a side scan image of a couple of dredge scars. And if you see 6 days later, they've started to fill back in the bottom picture. And this is just one example of some of the type of information that we see that I think is interesting. Last summer, we identified on side scan and on the magnetometer a target that we believe to be a potential UXO. It's not confirmed, but we nonetheless thought it important to share with the fishing industry. We transmitted this through a fisheries communication last summer. It's still available on our website as highlighted below. It's 37 nautical miles east-southeast of Barnegat Light, located in 121 feet of water. The coordinates are there. If anybody has further interest, please see me or contact our liaisons afterwards. We'd be happy to follow up. Our engagement outlook for the immediate future is focused on supporting the development of our construction and operation plans. So two specific engagements to support that would be the development of our NAV safety risk assessment, which will include some engagement with the commercial and recreational fisheries, also discussions around layout. And then with respect to survey activities, the scallop opening is planned for April 1 in the New York Bight access area. So we'll have some finer scale communications and engagements to support that. We still have one vessel that will be active into May that'll overlap some with that area. And then on the science and monitoring side, we're moving forward with the development of the cradle, working with John's team. And we're actively engaged. We have a New York Bight working group for the developers within our trade association, and that also gives us a forum where we can advance some of these ideas around regional management. One final slide that I wanted to wrap up with. This is an RWE company-wide initiative, but it would include community offshore wind. So last year, our company made a commitment that for new assets, we would aim to achieve a net positive impact on biodiversity by 2030. This is an ambitious commitment. It's one our team is excited about as we think about how to operationalize this at the project level. So it starts with a strategic commitment. And then in terms of how we do this, I think that's where the work is to be done. But our posture on this is going to be one of collaboration. So we would be collaborating with academic partners, stakeholders, and agencies to advance this concept and make progress on this. In parallel, we're currently running a competition that's just closed, and we hope to announce the winners of the competition this spring. And that's a global innovation competition focused on biodiversity enhancement and co-use. As we go through this, we'll be setting up a process whereby we create targets and develop science-based targets and then plan to monitor and track progress against that. The scale of RWE's global operations gives us some nice opportunities to pilot innovations, and that photo top right is one of the world's first fully recyclable offshore wind blades that's in use at our Kaskazi project. So we're excited about the ability to innovate in this space. And Mr. Chair, again, thank you for the opportunity to provide this update. Be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. It's always good to see you. Are there any questions from members of the council for Rick? Okay, seeing none at the table. Anyone online? I know we have a couple members participating online. Okay. I don't see any. So we have Emily online. John and Leela, maybe I could ask you guys to step back up to the table, and we'll open the floor to any follow-up discussion or questions that any of our presenters under the project update section of the agenda might have. And I'll also ask if there are members of the public in the audience or online, please raise your hand and I'll certainly give you an opportunity to ask your question or provide comment. Let me start with the council. Anyone here at the table? Rich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you, Rick. And also this question would be for the previous presenters as well. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the fisheries monitoring research that is planned or that's already, been approved? Thank you.
Yeah, Rich, I would say we're in terms of where we are in our process, we're still in the early stages of that. And we plan to use the the Cooperative Research and Development Agreement that I mentioned with the Northeast Center to serve to provide a foundation to inform the development of our monitoring and research plan. And part of our goal in that also is to think about how we can develop strategies that would promote a coordinated approach, a more coordinated and regional approach as we go through the process. Our team's very interested in thinking about how the data that we collect can be used to support regional science and be potentially integrated into regional assessments or stock assessments. We recognize that in doing that, there needs to be forethought, right? We can't simply come back and try to retrofit something into an assessment. So we're trying to front load our thinking around how our data could lend itself to being integrated and leverage and be leveraged, in the broader regional scientific endeavors.
Yeah, so similar for Kitty Hawk Wind, we are at the beginning of this process. So that was the December workshop I highlighted, was our sort of first time bringing together folks to talk about what we started rather than like thinking about what specific methodology we should use. We kept it broader at the first step to think about research questions that those 12 researchers and our fisheries representatives thought were important to address. So, and that meeting was sort of like a 3-hour in-person meeting. So we had a lot of good brainstorming and got to kind of dip our toes into the idea of what methodology and would be appropriate for those research questions. And we followed that meeting up immediately with folks from the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, in particular, thinking about how we could interface with some of their existing surveys and having really productive conversations with them about they are in the process of expanding one of their surveys that had previously not covered our lease area, but will now, starting this summer, cover our lease area. So thinking with them about how we can kind of, before they start that expansion and before we start our fisheries monitoring plan, how we can kind of work together to make sure that the data that we all collect is useful to everyone. So we are again kind of going to be taking those research questions that people came up with at that workshop and then start to look for input from fishermen. In April, we're planning to have some in-person sessions, and we will be continuing those conversations with NOAA folks, primarily through the Southeast Center, monthly starting next week, I believe. So, and we hope to kind of, when we've had input from various stakeholder groups, including as well DMF in North Carolina, we'll start to make some of that documentation publicly available so that we can kind of make sure that that's documented and available for folks.
Okay, thank you, Emily. I'll ask if you have any follow-up on that question.
For Vineyard Wind 1, we've been conducting trawl surveys, drop camera surveys, and lobster and larval plankton surveys in the lease area for several years pre-construction. And so now we're in the construction phase and we're doing the same round of surveys there. And those surveys were developed in consultation with commercial fishermen in the area. They're being implemented by the UMass Dartmouth School of Marine Science and Technology, and commercial fishing vessels are used to go out to the lease area to do that work. So that is all well underway, and all of the results of those fishery surveys are available on our website, vineyardwind.com.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else around the table from the council before I go to the public? Eric?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think this question is for you guys. When it comes to engaging industry vessels, Vineyard Wind they're well on their way. So they've got a suite of industry vessels that they already use. But those vessels have to qualify under certain criteria. And it's my understanding, and I might be slightly wrong, but I don't think I'm that wrong, is that the developers all have the potential to have different qualifying criteria. So would you consider standardizing your qualification criteria across developers? So it's not, if I want to work for Kitty Hawk, I have to do this. If I want to work for Mr. Robbins, it's a different set. Would you consider trying to work together to get one standardized criteria for qualifying vessels? And, scout vessels are one thing, survey vessels are another. And so that's just my question. Thank you.
No, thank you for that, Eric. And it has been a very large discussion. I can't speak on behalf of all the developers, but I can say that we have come, especially in New England, we've come together to look at what those processes look like, also align with and understand that there's two different lanes of that certification or safety requirements. There's the Coast Guard side of the house, and the Coast Guard's been doing a lot of work. And again, I don't want to speak on behalf of all the other developers, but it is in progress in New England to kind of ripple down into the other lease areas as they progress into the need for scout and safety vessels going forward. It is a challenge, and I think every developer is kind of looking at how to approach that. Alignment will be difficult, but if we can narrow that down to like a 90% alignment, just theoretically speaking, that would be something that would be a win for us. But there will be, I believe, some differences, but again, it's not a topic. It is not a topic that's being ignored. It's actually a topic of great concern. And again, I try not to jump into New England too much with these conversations, but I would like to say that we, as the fishery liaisons, meet monthly as well. And the topic every month is how we can bring to the table what our requirements are, not only being able to slide it across to each other for comparison, but then have the opportunity to slide that piece of paper and those requirements to commercial fishing vessels so that they know what the expectations are. I hope that answers your question.
Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, thank you. If I may follow as well, Mr. Chair. This is a subject of interest within the industry. It's also something we've discussed this within the industry. We've discussed it recently. Brought the issue up with D5 at a recent conference we had the opportunity to have with Coast Guard. And I think there are opportunities to make progress on this. I can just tell you that individually as a developer, our health and safety standards, and this is true of the industry, are extremely high. And so, you know, this question of how to address this, how to integrate fishing vessels into these opportunities is something that we are actively engaged in. We're right now trying to identify some potential wraparound resources to provide additional support to fishing vessels that would need to develop, for example, safety management systems, and then be prepared to go through an audit process to reach those specifications. But this is something that we're all talking about, we're all thinking about. There has been discussion at the industry level on this, but I would hope this is an area where we can continue to try to work together between both industries and also with some input potentially from Coast Guard to make progress on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to go off of, okay, one second. I'll take one more question, comment from the council. We'll go to the public, and then we're going to take a break. We're starting to bump up against our allotted time. Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll keep it brief. The question I had was towards Vineyard Wind and their compensation aspect. The timeline is from 2016 to 22 to qualify. I was curious if there's any consideration for historical participation in fisheries that took place in the lease area that have been curtailed or stifled or non-existent due in the last few years due to management schemes or reductions in TACs or fisheries that are currently under a rebuilding regime. I was just curious if any consideration had been leveraged toward that.
Not explicitly. In selecting that time frame, we considered a few factors. So part of the reason why we went for a 7-year time frame was because COVID-19 obviously disrupted fishing activities for a couple of years. And part of the reason why we go as far back as 2016 is because 2016 was a banner year for the squid fishery in the area. So we didn't want to exclude that from qualifying, but we never had a conversation specifically around whether we would need to further expand that to account for fisheries that may not be active in the lease area for management reasons. We assumed, hopefully not incorrectly, that the 7-year period would be enough for fishermen to qualify as long as they could show, 3 years of historical fishing activities. I think if there's a case to be made that the criteria in that regard is leaving people out, we would still encourage those fishermen to apply. And then the third-party administrator, in consultation with the fisheries advisors, could determine the best approach. The idea with this program is not to leave anybody out who would otherwise qualify. So if there's a gap in the criteria in any sort of program that we did not anticipate, our response would be apply, and then, there's a conversation to be had with the third-party administrator and the fisheries advisors.
All right, thank you, Emily, for that. I'm going to go to the public for a comment or two or question. I have Annie Hawkins online. Go ahead, Annie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is my audio working this time?
It works.
No.
I didn't
Oh,
hear
it
you
does.
very well,
Okay.
but yeah, if you can speak
Great.
up just a little bit.
Yeah, I sure can. So this is also a question about the Vineyard Wind Compensation Program. I think it's directed toward Emily, but it may be also partially a question for Mr. Penny or Mr. Hare. And it's also about this qualification process and specifically the materials that need to be provided to show qualification, some of which, given that two sources are needed, it sounds like the NIMS data and data requests are going to play pretty heavily into this process. So we with Rhoda have a project called the Fisheries Knowledge Trust, where we request fishing industry data from the agency. It's often VTR or dealer data. We've been working on this project for 5 years. We've worked with the agencies how to structure forms, frame the requests, work through glitches with permit history and proof of ownership, and then the data goes onto a secure server and we have to pull it down and format it in ways we can show it. And it's been an incredibly difficult process, not because of any lack of goodwill and effort on the agency, but it's just kind of a new thing that they're not used to processing a lot. And we're making improvements, but even still at this point with our current Fisheries Knowledge Trust projects, it's taking about 9 months to get updated data sets for VTR and landings data from the agency. So my question is, I'm encouraged, Emily, to hear that Vineyard Wind that has been working with NIMS and the data folks. But I'm wondering if this is a topic that's come up, if there's a new structure in place. We want to obviously help smooth this process with Rhoda, but as it stands, we're pretty concerned based on our experience with the agency that very unlikely that a new influx of data requests would be able to be processed in 90 days. So I'm hoping to hear a little more about that. Do we have any reason to believe that's possible? And if not, where can we go with this? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So in the conversation that we had with NIMS about a week or so ago, there was a concern about the timeliness of the data requests and whether they could be processed in the 90-day timeframe. There was no mention of a 9-month delay. There was, perhaps several weeks, but of course, depending on the type of data requested, the time to gather that data can take a lot longer. So for example, one of the examples that NIMS gave was that, for example, if a fisherman was asking for NIMS to plot out their data in the lease area to show fishing vessel tracks, that would take a lot more time than actually just giving the raw data. So the raw data, obviously, in that instance would be fine from the third-party administrator's perspective. We do understand that there could be some time lags associated with processing data requests, so the program will account for that, and fishermen will not be disqualified from the program if they are only waiting for a data request to be completed. So there is flexibility there, absolutely, and I think it'll be a bit of a live issue that we'll just have to see as the program rolls out. Is there unanticipated consequences associated with some of these data requests, and fishermen, can't get their application complete in those 90 days because they're waiting on a data request? I just want to make sure that everyone understands there would be flexibility in that instance, but also that's partly the reason why the program is so flexible in terms of the data that can be accepted to demonstrate fishing activities in the lease area. And our fishery advisors are local fishery advisors from the region, and they also have networks that they will canvass to confirm that a fisherman has fished in a lease area, partly in an effort to ensure that fishermen, to relieve the burden on providing all of that data. We are aware that it's not something that people just have hanging out on their computers. So yeah, there's a lot of flexibility. We're happy to coordinate with NIMS and other parties to really make sure that the fishermen who are eligible for the program get qualified for the program, and we will not be holding to arbitrary timelines that disqualify fishermen for things like this.
Great. If I could ask a really quick follow-up question, I'm wondering when the fishermen provide data, whether it's from the agency or from their business records, what can be the confidentiality expectations of data that they give to the developer for this purpose?
So none of the data is given to the developer. So we will not ever see any of the data. The data will go to the third-party administrator. All of the information can be submitted online. There's a user, name and password that fishermen will be asked to create for their application to protect it. It will be submitted securely online to the third-party administrator. Any financial information that is provided will only be available to and viewed by the third-party administrator. The fisheries advisors will not have access to any of the financial data. The fisheries advisors will only have access to the fishing data, the proof of historical fishing activity in the lease area that the fishermen provide. Other than that, there's the potential for, if there's a mediation or alternative dispute resolution process that a fisherman asks for as part of the program, that data and information would be available to that person. But the developer, Vineyard Wind, myself, other people that work on the team will never have access to any of that information provided by the fishermen.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you very much. And I want to thank our presenters, everyone who provided information to the council this morning. It's very much appreciated. We are at the end of our allotted time for this discussion, but I'm happy that we had such a robust discussion, lots of interaction between the presenters and the council and the public. So thank you all for being here with us today. We're going to take we'll take a 10-minute break. There's some snacks outside. We'll come back at 11:20 and pick up with the Black Sea Bass Stock Assessment overview. Thank you all. We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a minute or two. So if folks can begin to take your seats, that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, welcome back from break, everyone. I think folks will be trickling in here over the next couple minutes, but I'd like to move on to the next item on our agenda for this morning. And so we have a presentation on the Black Sea Bass Assessment Overview, the Research Track Stock Assessment. We have Larry here in person, and Kirsten is online, I believe.
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so Larry, are you presenting? Are you doing the presentation?
Actually, the slides are going to be advanced for me, so.
Okay, excellent.
Here,
Yeah,
absolutely.
whenever you're ready, you guys can get started. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So good morning, Chair, good morning, Council, and thank you for the invitation to provide an overview of the Black Sea Bass Research Track. Again, Larry Alida with the Population Dynamics Branch from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And here to, on behalf of the working group of the Black Research Track, who have done an exceptional job in terms of completing a research track. It was quite a challenging assessment, but I'll say that the working group did a really good job delivering a high quality product and achieving really significant advancements in the research track assessment. The working group, Black Sea Bass, the working group was, work of the working group was peer reviewed last December, and the panel reviewed the new approaches applied in the assessment along with the revised reference points and projections. The panel, this was a diverse and excellent panel selected by the Center of Independent Experts, included J.J. McGuire from the New England Fishery Management Council, SSC, Sven Skopchas from the European Commission Joint Research Center, Italy, Joe Research from Consulting USA, and the panel was chaired by Olaf Jensen. And the insights and the recommendations provided by the panel was quite invaluable and provided, some insights, moving forward as we continue to progress the development of the assessment itself. Next slide. So just to set the stage, the goal of the Black Sea Bass Research Track is to develop an assessment and a projection methodology that will be used in subsequent management track assessments. And in this case, Black Sea Bass is scheduled for a management track in June of 2024. There are 8 terms of reference here, and I'm not going to read them all, but they range from like looking at ecosystem considerations to estimating vital population estimates and developing an assessment that, a backup assessment approach in event like, the existing assessment do fail. Just to flag, stock status is not part of the terms of reference. I would say that the panel during their review agreed that generally all terms of reference were met, with the exception that terms of reference was partially met. Terms of reference 4, which is the model terms of reference. The panel agreed that the model and the terms of reference 4 was deemed acceptable for providing management advice. Where the panel felt additional work was needed in the terms of reference 4 was more so in developing additional sensitivity analysis to support the proposed model for use in future management track assessment. But they felt that the model was very strong enough and confident for it to move forward into the management track framework. Next slide. So here's to introduce you to the cast of characters who did the heavy lifting. So I'm just a messenger here, delivering the working group's work. The working group consisted of 9 members. It was chaired by Dr. Anna Mercer, who's the chief of the Cooperative Research Branch at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. The assessment lead, Dr. Kirsten Curdy. And there were 31 other contributors, of which a few are mentioned here on the slides here. The point here is that when you look at the affiliations, that the working group had a really diverse mix of working group members. It spanned from state, federal agencies, and nonprofits. And I think this really allowed for the research track to benefit from a rich array of perspective and expertise. Next slide, please. In terms of the general working group approach, I think the take-home message here is that, the group really worked hard. They had 42 working group meetings from August 2021 through December 2023. Within that same timeframe, the working group also held numerous sub-team meetings on a number of topics ranging from ecosystem and socioeconomic profile, natural mortality, recreational catch for angler index, discard mortality, and a lot of work spent looking at the WAM model that we'll talk about here. And collectively, you can imagine when you look at all those meetings that really scales up very quickly. There were 18 individual working papers that were provided on a variety of topics in addition to the main working group. And in terms of process, input and contributions from non-working group members were encouraged. All works were reviewed by discussions and consensus discussions. Rapporteurs documented information about decisions and rationales. And then the working group chair and the lead produced a draft report, which essentially all the working group members contributed and reviewed. Next slide. So the last time that the black sea bass was assessed was in the management track of 2021. I just want to note that black sea bass north of Cape Hatteras is managed as a single stock because biologically black sea bass is a single stock. We can go into that a little bit more. I'll say the model during the management track in 2021 was modeled as 2 regions to account for the colonial gradient or regional differences in biology. But these regions are not considered separate stocks. As you can see in the image to the right there, that the dividing line between the 2 regions approximates around like the location of the Hudson Canyon. 2021 involved the development of 2 distinct ASAP models. So this is a little bit different from what you see in the advancement of what was done with the state space model. And then the results are then combined for management purposes. The stock status back then, as the stock was considered not overfished, and this was at a terminal year of 2019. So the SSB then was about 205% of the SSB reference point. And the F estimate for the terminal year in 2019 was 89% of fishing mortality reference point. Next slide, please. So let's fast forward to the 2023 research track and talk about some of the advances that were made just to really set the stage. One, there was a multi-region state-space modeling framework to account for spatial dynamics, differences in productivity, and movement between the regions. A number of drivers were explored, and bottom temperature was chosen to model its impact on productivity of the stock. And given the Northeast expansion in recent years, the working group evaluated the impacts of varying catchability of the index of abundance using the VAST model. And this is an approach to standardize indices of abundance from multiple surveys. The working group also reevaluated natural mortality, discard mortality, but there was no sufficient evidence to change the existing M or discard mortality assumptions within the model. So as such, M was maintained at 0.4. The discard mortality for the trawl fishery was 100%, 15% for the hand line, and for the M, including the pots and traps, including the rack as well. One of the really important, workflow in terms of how the working group developed their workflow was to ensure that there was enhanced reproducibility of data, more important when it comes to imputation of information. So essentially, they really developed this in such a way that in future times that, they have standardized approaches in terms of how the data is developed going into the model to ensure that it's reproducible, having sets of rules. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through each of the terms of reference and sort of kind of talk about some of the accomplishments and some outcomes there. So starting with the first terms of reference in terms of ecosystems consideration, the working group updated biological information. We looked at growth, maturity, length, weight information to account for some of those seasonal and regional differences. There was a spatial temporal modeling of abundance of indices where VAST, I mentioned earlier, and also accounted for the environmental drivers and the varying catchability of the individual surveys. And particularly, important for many of those state surveys that have comparatively small geographic footprints. So VAST became important in terms of standardizing those indices. Food habits was examined. Black sea bass not commonly found in the stomachs of predators, so there was really no additional information there, but they did look at it and attempted to evaluate that. And then in terms of the ecosystems considerations, there were really two papers that drove the hypothesis of ecosystem drivers for this assessment. One was the Moser and Shepard paper in 2009, which evaluated a coastwide tagging study for black sea bass and noted seasonal migration of black sea bass and mixing of metapopulations. Second was looking at the Miller et al. Paper, which looked at overwintering distribution and found that winter offshore distribution was correlated with the location of the shelf slope front. Also found that there was a lack of correlation between younger the year and year class strength, which suggests that overwintering survival could be a bottleneck for year class strength. So the two hypotheses really drove sort of this ecosystem consideration. The first, if you look at years where we had higher winter bottom temperatures across the shelf, we expect to have higher overwintering survival and higher recruitment. Hence, bottom temperature was used as a covariate in the model that I'll mention in future slides. And then in years where you have higher shelf water volume, which implies lower temperature and salinity conditions, you have less offshore winter thermal habitat, which will result in more movement of black sea bass from the north to the southern region. Next slide. Part of the research track is also really engaging with industry members to provide a sense check on the information going into the research track. So the working group, worked with industry groups and they develop a list of black sea bass stakeholders, contact information. They developed a list of topics, to cover with each of the stakeholders. There were 16 conversations and mostly involved black sea bass industry members with over 20 years of experience. Sort of the breakdown of the demographic, about 10 commercial, 6 recreational, 7 from the Mid-Atlantic, 9 from New England, and looking at 4 different fleets, the trawl, pot, gillnet, hook and line. And the topics included looking at, really talking about fishing operations, getting insight about selectivity, biogeography in terms of distribution and abundance, migration, habitat associations, behavior, trophic ecology, and CPUE drivers. And essentially, how is this information being used in the research track? It's used as a way to vector check the fishery data and discard mortality estimates, and inform the commercial CPU index development explorations, helps with the interpretation and provide context for the fishery data and survey indices, and as well as the model output and results. Next slide. So terms of reference 2 with the fishery data. So I did mention earlier there was a reevaluation of the discard mortality, no change there. There was a spatial temporal characterization of the catch expansions. I mentioned semi-automation of the catch estimation with repeatable rules for boring in years where you have gaps or seasons. There was the addition of the scallop fleet to the discard estimation. And then new data stream that came on was the Commercial Fishery Research Foundation for Black Sea Bass Research Fleet for the discards at length. The size data from the discard, the CRF, the CFRF data, from the kept component was not used because with the federal information or port sampling information, because the estimated landings and length for those data does not include market category. However, when it came to the discard component, sampled through the Black Sea Bass Research Fleet, that was combined with the Federal Observer data and to estimate the discard at length expansions because market category is not a concern in this case. I'll do mention also that the H-length keys from the CFRF were also incorporated in development of H-length keys for the discard information. Next slide. So here's a summary of the fishery catch by region. So to orient you at the plots that you're looking at. So the top plots are the northern, the bottom ones are to the south, left plots are the nominal, and to the right there are the portion contributions by fleet. That's the commercial discard, commercial landings, direct discards, direct landings. And so what we see in the north, roughly average about 870 metric tons through 2009. So this general increase in the north from about 2010 to 2015, which has averaged, over 6,300 metric tons since 2016. In the south, over 3,000 metric tons to 2003, declined slightly during the mid-2000s, and then has averaged about roughly 1,700 metric tons since 2006. In terms of the recreational contribution in the north, we see this general increase over the time series, representing about 38% of the total catch through 2000 and 75% since 2009. And then in the south, the catches averaged in terms of the proportion contribution from the rec was about 69% of the total fishery, but there wasn't really any trends that were exhibited over time. Next slide. Here it's looking at the total fishery catch at length, and I apologize, this might be a difficult figure to look at, but the take-home message here is that we see an expansion in the length structure more pronounced in the north. The discards comprise more of a smaller lengths compared to the landings. Just to kind of give you a little bit of context there, during the 1990s, the mode for the length distributions were roughly about 23 centimeters in both regions. And this has increased during the 2000s, and since 2010 onwards, we're about 36 centimeters in the north and 32 centimeters in the south. Next slide. Here we are looking at the total fishery catch at age. And so we are looking at the age compositions with the years on the x-axis and the age on the y-axis. And what you can see here is that we do see also an expansion in both regions in terms of the age structure. The cohort tracking is more apparent in the north. You see the 2011 and the 2015 year classes, but not as clear in the southern region. Next slide. In terms of reference 3, looking at the survey data, so in terms of what was accomplished here, 26 indices of abundance were considered. New indices of abundance were explored, included the ventless trap survey, the fall trawl surveys, and the commercial CPUE. Included here is also the Gulf of Maine strata, which was not included in previous assessment. And then, of course, the standardization of the individual surveys using the VAST model to produce an aggregate index of abundance. And then there's the fishery-dependent index of abundance for the catch for angler and exploration of the commercial CPUE. Next slide. So here you're looking at the output from the VAST models with the individual states and federal surveys that's included here. Again, just to kind of provide a little bit more context for the VAST modeling, it's an area-weighted approach. And so it's a really nice way to sort of really bring different like indices with various like footprint, as we mentioned, as we know, some of the state surveys has very different footprints here. The spring is used in the model and not in the fall, and that was done in the past, and this is related to the distribution of, sea bass and availability. So as you can see in the spring, we see that in the north, which is the top plots there, top right, we see that this increase that has occurred in recent years. But you look in the south, the trends there are relatively stable. That's been estimated by the bass model. Next slide. One of the benefits of the VAS model is able to provide not just only the aggregate information, the aggregate indices, but also the age compositions can also be standardized as well too. So you can see here, looking at the age compositions and focusing more on the spring here, we see that same 2011, 2015 year class that is very apparent in the north, somewhat in the south, but not as strong as well. So we see that same story consistently produced in our model-based estimate, which is comparable to what we're seeing in the fishery catch at age as well. Next slide. So here's the recreational catch per angler. The top plots give you the aggregate, and the left to the north and the right to is the south. And what we see is the same story here, where we see this really strong increase in the north. And we also see in the age composition as well too, where we're seeing this strong 2011 and 2011 year class. We also seen the age structure expansion as well too, which shows up in the age composition for the recreational catch per angler. Next slide. So next I'll be going over sort of the model reference points and projections. Again, the research track focuses on methodology in terms of like what was accomplished in terms of the development of the model. We have a multi-region state space multi-WAM model there that accounts for the spatial dynamics and differences in productivity, mixing between the regions. Bottom temperature used as a covariate in the recruitment, and the projections also considered the recent recruitments. In terms of like supporting model, this is more so to ground truth to see what's coming out of the WAM. So stock synthesis was also, modeled alongside to sense check the outputs for the WAM, and it was quite comparable to the WAM outputs, which is confidence to see two independent models giving you similar results. Also, the estimate of movement were provided by the stock synthesis model, which were also used to inform the WAM model movement parameters. Next slide. A little bit of a deeper dive into the WAM formulation here. So it's a two-region model, single model, two-region, different from what was done with ASAP, where we had two distinct models and we combined them together. But here we have one single formulation and we can incorporate regional differences there. Time series from 89 to 2021, the age 1 to 8+. In terms of the fishery catch, it's commercial and fishery fleets in each of the region. In terms of selectivity, we allowed for time and age varying processes in the north only. So this is one of the advantages of WAM, where we can actually allow for varying processes on different assumptions within our model, where in the past, those things were considered fixed effects. In terms of the indices, we had the recreational catch per angler and the spring vast model outputs. And the selectivity was age and year varying processes, also in the north only. In terms of environmental processes, bottom temperature was a covariate on recruitment in both regions. Maturity was age and time varying. Movement rates were priors, as I mentioned earlier in the previous slide, from stock synthesis. And then natural mortality was 0.4. And this is constant across ages, years, and region. Next slide. So just some really, results from the assessment. So we have the north and the south. And what we do see here, just to orient you before I even dive in, the bars are the recruitment estimates, and the yellow solid line there, which is really hard to see on the screen in here, is your spawning stock biomass. North to the left, south to the right. And what we see immediately that jumps out in the north is this really strong increase towards the end of the time series in the spawning stock biomass. But what's really driving that are those 2-year classes that you can see that jumps out, which is those 2011 and 2015 year class. We also see that there's a slight increase towards the end of the South, but not as strong. If you look at the scale compare, you know that the scale is quite different between the North and the South. We saw that decline in SSB roughly around the early 2010s. But in the increase that we see is partly, the sort of above some of the average level recruitments we're seeing in recent years. So having those cumulative effect, we think that that's an accumulation of SSB, which may be contributing to that slight increase we're seeing at the end of that time series. Slide. So here's looking at estimates of spawning stock biomass and fishing mortality. The top plot there is giving you the aggregate fishing mortality by region, gray being the north, the sort of yellow greenish line there is the south. And again, same story that we saw here where we see that a strong increase in spawning stock biomass towards the end of the time series there in the north compared to the south. In terms of the fishing mortality, what we have here are the aggregated across the fleet by region of the estimates of fishing mortality, really quite variable towards the end of the time series. And then to the right here, maybe a bit of a difficult plot to really interpret. These are fleet-specific fishing mortality. So essentially what was done here was taking this fleet-specific mortality, aggregate them to calculate, the aggregate to the left, which are the fishing mortality estimates by region for the north and the south. So just kind of looking at by the fleet, what we see here in terms of trends is that we do see that earlier in the time series, which is that sort of yellow line, that we saw that the contribution of the recreation fishing mortality was quite great. And now in recent years, it's more so the north where we see the recreational Fs are much higher compared to the other fleets there. Next slide. Again, just being redundant here, stock status recommendations are not part of the research track terms of reference, and the results from the research track would not be used directly in the management track assessment. What will happen here is that we are currently in the middle of updating this research track with data that will include 2022 and 2023. And so you can expect that, at that point, we'll have new information which will inform stock status determination. What's really important is really that we have a methodology and approach that's, really been reviewed and accepted for moving forward. So the reference points in terms of the methods are based on a 5-year average of the selectivity, maturity, weighted age, and incorporated recruitment estimates from 2000 onward. In terms of short-term projections, this included forecasting bottom temperature as a covariate for recruitment. And in terms of looking at the term year estimates from using term year 2021, we have our reference points estimated here. And so we look at 2021, we're saying here that, based on the methods, we have about 108% of the F reference point, and SSB is 181 of the SSB reference points. But keep in mind, this is term year 2021. And, with the updates of new data, this information is bound to be revised again. The take-home message here is that the approach and the methodology used to inform from the research track would now be carried forward to understand where we are with regards to stock status. Okay, next slide. So looking at short-term projections, so to the left here are sort of plots looking by region, north and south, and so similar plots with the bars are the recruitment, and the yellow line there is the SSB. And what we have is a 3-year recruitment. And so looking at the aggregate to the right, we see that there is being a decrease in SSB. Keep in mind that, this decline is because we're fishing at the F40 and 2, we're still well above the estimated reference points with the terminal year in 2021. Next slide. In terms of research recommendations, I'll say the working group really accomplished addressing research recommendations from previous assessments. New research recommendations came about during the development of the research track, and they were prioritized based on high, medium, low. Well, looking at the high priority research recommendations listed here, there's still, some level of uncertainties that needs to be addressed. But listed here, we have movement rate and understanding drivers, the role and drivers of bearing recruitment and stock dynamics, reliable indices of abundance beyond existing surveys, enhanced sampling to support estimation of fishery length and age comps, and metrics for measuring recruitment as a response variable to environmental indicators. I guess the take-home message here is that, that while WAM does a good job in terms of capturing the underlying variances that we see in our results or within the estimates from our model, there's still a need, some interest in really understand some of the mechanisms that are really driving, some of these trends that we're seeing. Next slide. So part of the terms of reference, we have to develop a backup assessment approach in the event that, a model does fail. And so we have something to fall back on to provide advice. And the effort here was to stay within the WAM framework to provide more flexibility moving forward. A number of stocks here in the Northeast have taken on this example, including place. And I believe also Bluefish as well is taking this same course here. And the guidance here is based on the index-based research track that you are better off operating in an analytical framework than in an index-based approach here. So in the event, say in the future that this model becomes problematic, we can reconfigure this model to have an ASAP-like effect, with the fixed effects, and we have to adjust for retrospective patterns, we can certainly do so. But the idea is that we want to be able to use, a lot of information that we have here, to be able to do a better job in terms of informing the stock rather than sort of using an index to really, which is much more subjective compared to this analytical framework here. Next slide. So in terms of the peer review panel recommendations required for the 2024 management track, they wanted exploration of alternative parameterizations of natural mortality. So for example, look at age-independent constant values or age-dependent M. Profiles of initial fishing mortality, which is the initial depletion assumption within the model. And last, which is more so an evaluation of a priori, which surveys are thought to be robustly tracking index of abundance here. And sort of discussion around here is while we have all these indices that are being used in the VAST model, can we all look at each of these indices a priori to see which one we think is more robust, tracking abundance, and include them in the VAST model? So that was sort of taking more of a deliberate approach, in terms of being intentional about which surveys are going into the VAST model to really see if we're really still tracking similar trends. So that, I think, concludes my presentation. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. A lot of really good information in there. I'm counting on you, Rich, to ask a good question. There we go. It's one of the few folks in the room probably that could understand all the details. But go ahead, Rich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. There's a lot of information there. Is there any retrospective bias that we should be aware of as it pertains to, as it would affect their short-term stock projections for our quotas?
Yeah, I would say, and I wish I provided that information. It's also in the report. My recollection is that the retrospective biases were not considered significant, which would not require any sort of retrospective adjustment at the moment. So much more improved diagnostics when it comes to the retrospective patterns.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the presentation, Larry. I guess I was curious in reading through the review panel report, they make note of development of annually varying biological reference points that, model changes in stock productivity without having to specify a mechanistic basis for these changes. And I'm just wondering, the review panel commented on this and noted that, although this allows for reflecting stock productivity changes over time, without a need to develop explicit environmental covariates of productivity, that this could present some additional challenges in communicating management advice, that being the use of dynamic reference points. And so I'm just wondering if you can provide a little bit more context on how this time series of calculation of dynamic reference points is different than, how we've been receiving management advice on our BRPs in the past.
Yeah, so in terms of the way we calculate the reference points, I think the 5-year averages, for example, we saw with the weights of the age or standard protocol. I think we also use 10-year bins for the length-weight relationships, which I think it's comparatively small. I think that in terms of the annual reference points, we don't use that for stock status determination. So in terms of allowing for consistency, in terms of how you calculate your reference points using dynamic, and then want to compare that to your stock status determination, we want to ensure some consistency between both of those. In terms of and I think in terms of understanding the implications of productivity, one of the things that were included in the projections was the temperature information that was used as a covariate. And I think the plan is, and I'm not sure what the challenge would be, is to sort of use that same methodology in terms of really accounting for this sort of variance or the internal variability that's accounted for by recruitment, by temperature in the projections moving forward. Not only both for for the projections, but I don't think that's the case for the reference points. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I have a question for you, and just let me know if I'm way off track and it's not making sense. But you mentioned in your presentation that this research track is not used for management, and that a management track assessment is upcoming this summer into later this year. But were there any indicators, and maybe I missed it if you mentioned it, but were there any preliminary indications that the information from the research track, which will feed the management track assessment, are going to significantly change or alter the current management of sea bass? Is there any chatter about kind of what you found in the research track and how that may be accepted in the management track, and whether or not those of us that are managing these fisheries need to start getting prepared for something large or looming as we get into discussions with our partners at the Atlantic States Commission and with New England as well?
Yeah, very good question. And so in terms of the research track, I guess to just be clear, we're not using those results directly. Essentially what we're doing is really focusing on developing really robust approaches that can stand the test of time. So our focus has not really been looking at what the outcome are. It would be a little bit more, premature to really say that, oh, we are going to be in this state, given that we have 2 additional years of data we're going to add, to the data. We do have an AOP that is upcoming, and we know that we have our scientists who are working diligently, really working through that data and trying to kind of get a sense of where things are. And I think that, once that information becomes more readily available through our AOP process and we're communicating as the model's developing, we'll have a much better sense. Here we went into the research track just for the sole reason that okay, we need a model that really can stand the test of time. And we are very confident we have a really, improved product here that, we're confident that will hold up, for the time being.
Okay, thank you. Rich?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the more striking results from this assessment was the difference in the fishing mortality rates between the regions, with the southern region having about half the fishing mortality rate than the northern region. Did the group discuss that at all? And if so, could you talk about that a little bit further?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing differences in the dynamic of the, the catch, and over the years. And what we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, you look at the fleet specific one, you see like, oh, in the South earlier in the time series that, the recreational fishing mortality was quite high. And we've seen, let's see this sort of shift, more so into the North here. That's could be that occurred as the outcome of the assessment. Now, in terms of the aggregate, what you're looking at is a collapse of like, the fleet specific Fs that are really combined together to like, really provide you a F by region, which we also combine to get like a total F across, the entire North and South combined together. So in terms of like what those Fs are, they did have a conversation about it. They compared it to the previous ASAP model. They found that some of the F that was coming out of the WAM model was quite comparable to the Fs that they were seeing with the previous ASAP model. So it gave some confidence to the working group that, that this estimate, taking a red face test, that it really made sense having an independent, like, sort of view from two different perspectives.
John Hare.
Thank you. If I may, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to emphasize a couple of points. Dr. Alati went through these, but I think it is important to just stop and reflect on the value of this research track assessment that has been brought to the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council for management. I think it shows the value of this new, not new anymore, but the research track process. The working group was diverse. It had Northeast Fisheries Science Center scientists, state scientists, academic scientists, and that group worked together to put this assessment before a peer review panel. And that was one of the main intents of making this change to a research track process, was to have these working groups have broad scientific representation. There was also a significant amount of stakeholder engagement. I've been sitting at this table now for 7 years, and in the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, we understand the value that fishermen's knowledge has. And this assessment really does a good job incorporating that knowledge into not the model explicitly, but into the frame around which the model was completed. And so that's, stakeholder engagement, fishermen's ecological knowledge is an area where we'll continue to work, but this assessment really, has done an excellent job there. Now, the other piece is, Dr. Alati said there's 26 different fishery independent surveys in this assessment, but they were all sort of combined in a statistical framework. And this is one of the first times we've combined multiple indices in a statistical framework. Before, you'd have 26 indices, and an assessment scientist would say, well, I think this one's really important, so I'm going to give it more weight. I think this one's maybe less important, so I'm going to give it less weight. And it was very subjective in terms of how 26 indices would go into an assessment model. Using this vast statistical approach, vario, area, spatial, temporal, something like that. I know the acronym, it's VAST. Using the statistical framework provides this, an objective rationale as to how to include these 26 indices. Two other points that I'd like to make. The assessment includes catch per unit effort, which was derived from the commercial fishery, and landings per unit effort, which was derived from recreational fishing data. Again, incorporating the data that's collected by both commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen. And then lastly, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first assessment in this region where we have a temperature term directly in the model. Both units have a temperature dependent recruitment function. And we've talked here for many, many years that climate change is important and is affecting our fishery. Now, with this assessment as a model, we have a way to include climate enforcing on recruitment. So we've got projections, from this research track. One of our next steps at the Science Center is to couple this modeling framework with the Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative and the climate projections that will be developed there. And we'll be able to project the sea bass population dynamics into the future, next 5-10 years, and look at how different fishing scenarios can help us maintain the sustainability of the stock while still maintaining the sustainability of the fishery. So I think this is a really excellent example of the value of the research track process, which the NRCC put into place in 2019. We're not done. We're going to continue to evolve our science, but I think it's worth just stopping and reflecting on how important this research track assessment is for us all. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. Appreciate it. All right, seeing no other hands at the table, I'm going to go to our folks online. I have Emerson Hasbrook. Emerson is with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission representing New York. Go ahead, Emerson.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Ileta, for your presentation. So my question is relative to one of your slides. It was under Tour 2. I think it was the second or third slide under Tour 2, maybe slide 10, thereabouts. Yeah, that one. You just went by it. Yeah, that slide. Yeah, that slide. Thank you. So a couple of years ago, we implemented Amendment 22 for reallocation of several species, including black sea bass. And this resulted in a revised allocation of 45% commercial and 55% recreational based on catch. So this slide shows that the North has been at about 75% recreational catch recently and 69% recreational catch in the South. Also, one of your subsequent slides showed that recreational F has been increasing. So I have two questions, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, Dr. Ileta, and I don't know if you're the appropriate person to answer these, but I'm going to ask them anyhow. So it's a two-part question. One is this high recreational catch higher than what's in our reallocation amendment? Is this high recreational catch due to us essentially ignoring the RHL overages over the past several years? And the second part of that, is this indicative of the issue of, quote, borrowing, unquote, that the SSC identified as a potential impact of the harvest control rule? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think your interpretation of those proportions and the contribution of the recreational catch is quite accurate. I think that, in terms of how this was really, developed, I think that, a lot of work was gone into making sure the accuracy that was going into developing the data stuff. Now, however, in terms of how this really relates to to the allocation issue, I think that, I would probably will defer to my policy colleagues here to really provide context around that. But what I can say here is that, those proportions are quite accurate in terms of when we see those contributions in recent years where the North has certainly been a major, the North recreational component has been a major contributor in terms of the total removals here.
I'm going to go to Mike Penny, and then Adam, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I guess thanks, Chairman. Just following up with Emerson's question. Emerson, I'm not clear. Were you suggesting that the recreational harvest control rule led to this shift in distribution? Because the data on this graph are through 2021.
That's correct.
We implemented the recreational harvest control rule in 2023. So these data represent the results of catch and the distribution of catch under the old regime, not the recreational harvest control rule.
Thank you, Mike. Excuse me. Okay, to answer, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Well, part of my question was relative to the harvest control rule. And yes, I understand that it's only been recently implemented. But the first part of the question was that, you know, in both the north and the south, the recreational catch has been quite a bit higher than what the reallocation amendment implemented. And I realize that the reallocation amendment is relatively recent. And before that, the recreational allocation was lower, but that was based on harvest, not catch. So anyhow, that part of the question was, is this high percentage of recreational catch due to the fact that we've essentially been, I'm going to use this term, I know we haven't been ignoring it, but we've essentially been ignoring or not really addressing RHL overages for the past at least 6 or 7 years.
All right, Mike's going to offer some thoughts. We were just having a little sidebar. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Emerson, there's actually, I mean, as you probably know, there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the changes in management and our understanding of rec catch over the years. But just two things I guess I would flag is that when the agency changed MRIP to go to the mail survey from the phone survey, and we did the reanalysis, if you will, of all the historical data on rec catch. The rec catch numbers turned out to be much higher than we realized at the time. When we did the reallocation amendment a few years ago, the council's decision was to constrain that decision based on the original time period used to set that allocation. So that would put us back to the commercial versus rec catch in the effectively 80s. So if you look, at least I'm looking at the graph and I'm seeing much, at least in the north, much lower catch on the rec side in the 80s. Even acknowledging that that was higher than we realized at the time, based on the change in MRIP. So I think what we're looking at is, or what we're seeing is a result of a number of changes, both in our understanding of rec catch and in the allocation system that are sort of coming together to give us this data that we have here. All along, we've had accountability measures that the council has utilized to address concerns with catch in excess of the recreational harvest limits or ABCs and ACLs. And so while we might have a healthy, robust debate about the effectiveness of those AMs, I don't think that those were directly contributing to what we're seeing in the data here.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm going to go we'll take one more question from the public. We have Mike Wayne online. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me, I assume?
Yes.
Thanks. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. My question is for the assessment presenter. You talked about the research track being really investigative. And so I think, as you're aware, the MRIP recreational catch data are currently undergoing some additional uncertainty associated with, I guess, what was a pilot study that looked into question order, et cetera. Anyways, the initial results of that study suggest that the recreational catch could be overestimated. So my question to the stock assessment lead here is, through the research track, were you able to run sensitivity analyses that would look at adjustments to the recreational catch to see how that may or may not impact some of the uncertainties associated with this assessment?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the simple answer is like no, because we just didn't have any info about how the MROP data will be adjusted. Now, in the event that, that information becomes like, available and official, and that certainly that, will be something that can be considered within the scope of the management track assessments to like, really look at changes in the data, which fits well with one of the levels. So yeah, the short answer is like, no, that was not considered as a sensitivity analysis during the research track assessment.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman, follow up real quick.
real quick, Mike, thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's TORs associated with that management track assessment, Mr. Chairman, but I think it would be wise if there are to add some sensitivity analyses of lower recreational catch. Those sensitivity analyses are simply analytical in nature, helping the council understand what a lower catch may look like in terms of what the assessment results are. Thank you.
Yeah, I think to respond to your question, I think that the management track is actually well within the bounds of looking at any data changes that come right in. So the beauty of it is that if we have some new MRIP estimates that does require a sensitivity analysis, it does not necessarily have to be explicitly in the TORs, but it's within the bounds of the levels of review to say that we have new information here, and the AOP have to make that determination that those sensitivity analysis should be done and can assign the appropriate level associated with that. So anything related to data changes is well within the realms of a management track assessment process.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you all thank you for the presentation, Larry, and thanks for the questions. We're going to go ahead and break for lunch. It's about 12:15. We're going to be back at 1:30 to pick up our afternoon items on today's agenda. So thanks again for being here, Larry, and see you all after lunch.